everyone. So we are back to it, and hopefully we will get to conclude the trial today, and then we can start getting into the nitty-gritty of what we know, what we don't know, and what we're being told, what we should believe, what the things that we shouldn't believe. And the last time we were here, we were watching the... Hello, Karen. We were watching one of the doctors testify regarding Nick and his autism and disabilities. Now, we heard that he was claiming disability, which, you know, like in our country, you know, you don't just get disability for the sake of getting disability. And Gypsy Rose Blanchard, you know, did take advantage of that. So she I would say the word I would use would be groomed Nick into doing what he did, using his vulnerabilities and knowing that he had strong feelings for her. He, you know, he believed that he took the V card away from her, and that's not true, is it? Because we know about Dan the man, and so we know that element isn't true. And we know the one thing that happens in most cases with Gypsy is that everything that she says is never really the truth or a twist on the truth. So today we're going to continue, and we are going to go into the trial day 3 with the Dr. Robert Denney, who is a clinical psychologist who is also now going to testify. And let's see what he has got to say. I have to say, though, so far, having watched the defence put on a defence for Nick, I'm not impressed with his defence. And I would have said ineffective counsel, and perhaps back in the time when the trial was done and he was found guilty and sentenced, that he perhaps didn't understand that he had ineffective counsel and just accepted what was dished out to him. But I guess we won't ever really know the answer to that. So without further ado, let's get into the day 3 with Dr. Denney, and let's see what Dr. Denney has got to say.
Please be seated. Ms. Perry, do you have any additional evidence in this shooting?
Yes, at this time, the potential arrest.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the defense has rested its presentation of evidence. Mr. Pashy, do you have any rebuttal evidence?
Yes, sir. State calls Dr. Robert Denney.
Yes, sir. Dr. Denney, come on up. Have a seat. This way, do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause now pending before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Patterson.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you take your name for the record and spell your last name for the court reporter?
Robert L. Denney, last name Denney.
How are you employed?
I am a private practitioner in the area of clinical psychology.
Could you explain to us a little bit what psychology is?
Well, psychology is actually quite broad and can include anything from running rats in mazes to studying human behavior. Clinical psychology is focused more on human behavior and how to measure that, and how to hopefully improve that for people.
Do you practice in any other specific areas of psychology?
Yes, I practice in 2 different specialty areas. One is forensic psychology, and the other is clinical neuropsychology.
Could you tell us a little bit about what clinical neuropsychology is?
Clinical neuropsychology is the study of brain behavior relationships. So a clinical psychologist or a clinical neuropsychologist is a clinical psychologist that has advanced training in the brain, neuroanatomy, neuropathology, how the brain functions, and how to measure the brain and evaluate people with brain abnormalities and things like that.
And what about forensic psychology?
Forensic psychology is generally a clinical psychologist who has some specialized training in the area of the application of that clinical psychology principles to areas of the law, which could include civil law, personal injury maybe, or other forms of law, criminal law, of course, as well.
I'll show you what I've marked as State's Exhibit 187. Do you recognize State's Exhibit 187?
Yes, I do.
What is it?
That's my CV,
What is a CV, just briefly?
curriculum vitae. It's a resume, fancy word for a resume.
How many pages is your resume?
22, I believe.
Move to admit State's Exhibit 187.
No objection, Judge.
Received without objection.
Are you licensed as a psychologist?
Yes, I am.
Where?
I have a license to practice psychology in Missouri. I also have a license to practice in the District of Columbia, that's Washington, D.C. And then I have a temporary license to practice in the state of Alaska.
Do you hold any board certifications?
Yes, I do.
What are they?
2 different board certifications. Number 1, I am board certified in forensic psychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology, and have been since 1997. The other board certification is in the area of clinical neuropsychology, also by the American Board of Professional Psychology. I've been board certified in neuropsychology since 2003.
How is being board certified different than being licensed?
Well, a license gives you permission to practice. It means you have the adequate amount of knowledge and skill to do the practice. Board certification is a level beyond that, where you've actually put your own skills, your own work product, into the hands of other experts in the field, where they review it and evaluate not only your credentials, your training, but also your actual work samples. And then they also interview you for like a 3-hour-long panel interview regarding your understanding, your skills, your knowledge base, your thinking in regard to diagnostics and application of the psychological tests to the case, things like that, as well as treatment issues. And so board certification validates or verifies your advanced skill in that specialty area in the eyes of other experts in the field.
How many people are board certified in both clinical neuropsychology and forensic psychology,
I believe there are 8,
including yourself?
including myself.
Have you had an opportunity to testify as an expert before?
Yes, I have.
On how many cases?
Well over 100. I've lost count. Once I hit 100, I stopped counting.
Would you tell the jury a little bit about your educational background?
Yes, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in youth ministry and biblical studies from the Lutheran Bible Institute in Seattle. And then I changed my track a little bit and obtained a master's degree in psychology from the Forrest Institute of Professional Psychology, and then ultimately obtained a doctor of psychology, also from the Forrest Institute of Professional Psychology, and I obtained that in 1991.
With regard to your master's degree, did you graduate with any honors?
Magna cum laude, I believe.
What's that mean?
It's a fancy Latin phrase, meaning you got a pretty good grade point.
What about your doctor of psychology?
Same with that.
Did you serve an internship of some kind?
I did, as part of my doctoral degree. One of the requirements was a year-long full-time practice setting under supervision of licensed psychologists. And that internship for me from 1990 through 1991 was at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners.
Here in Springfield?
Yes, in Springfield.
And during that internship, was there a forensic rotation?
Yes, there were several rotations. There was an inpatient psychiatric treatment rotation, which was major. There was also a major rotation in forensic assessment. That's where we learned how to perform forensic psychological evaluations for the U.S. district courts under the supervision of a licensed or board certified forensic psychologist. Then I also had rotations in medical, surgical parts of the hospital and substance abuse. A part of that internship also included outplacement for me 1 day a week at the Missouri Rehabilitation Center in Mount Vernon. It was a head injury rehabilitation hospital. And then I also had part of the year 1 day a week at Cox North, an adolescent substance abuse treatment program.
Have you had the opportunity to teach in the area of criminal forensic psychology?
Yes, I have.
And have you served as a director of any psychology education program?
Yes, I was a professor at the Forrest Institute, which is a graduate program in clinical psychology. And I was the director of the forensic program there for a number of years, just a small number, maybe 3 or 4.
Have you served on the editorial board of any peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, I have, and I do.
What does it mean when a journal or an article is peer-reviewed?
Well, the way the system works is researchers, authors, do the research and they write up the papers and then they submit it to a scientific journal. The editor looks at that paper and decides whether it's appropriate for the journal and whether it appears to advance our knowledge in the science. And if they think it's good, then they send it to the editorial board. The editorial board are people scattered all around the world who are experts in the field in that area. And those individuals then review the research and critique it. Okay, identifying whether the methods are appropriate, the subjects are appropriate, are the conclusions and results appropriate, does that all make sense, and does it fit with our understanding of science? And then they rate the paper, and so peer-reviewed journals that have peer-reviewed papers, simply they have editorial boards that review the submissions and determine whether it's good science or not. And once it's approved by the editorial board, then it can be published.
Have you published papers in the area of forensic psychology?
Yes, I have.
Have you published a paper with regard to autism?
Yes, I have.
I want to talk a little bit about your work history. After you left that internship with the Bureau of Prisons, what did you do after that?
Well, actually, they hired me immediately at the end of my internship. I left on Friday as an intern, came back on Monday as a staff psychologist. And the role they wanted to put me in was as a forensic psychologist, which I couldn't do exactly until I was licensed. And you have to be licensed. But in the federal system, you can be licensed in any state in the union. And so I took the examination right away and became licensed in Arizona. So for the first couple months, I was practicing in the medical surgical side of the hospital, but then come January of 1992, I rotated over to do forensic studies, which I did full time there for 8 years.
Could you just briefly describe how it's different to work in the forensic unit as opposed to the medical surgical area?
Yes. Let me, if I may,
Sure.
first of all, explain the U.S. Medical Center. We all know it's here, but not everybody understands what happens there. It's about a 1,100-bed medical surgical psych hospital for the Federal Bureau of Prisons male inmate population. And in that hospital, there's medical and surgical units, right? Sentenced inmates who may be somewhere in the country that need medical care, they'll be sent here to Springfield to receive that medical care. There's also psychiatric treatment units there, and so same thing for sentenced inmates that need psychiatric care, inpatient psychiatric care. They're referred to Springfield for that inpatient psychiatric care. The medical center also has a forensic evaluation unit, and this unit is a smaller unit of generally pre-trial detainees. And the U.S. district courts from around the country and U.S. territories, if they have a defendant where there's mental health concerns or concerns about competency, dangerousness, what have you, sanity, various things that would be relevant for their case, the judge often sends them to the Federal Bureau of Prisons for an evaluation to answer specific questions. And so the evaluations that we did at the medical center were court referrals where we answered those types of questions: competency, stand trial, mental state at the time of the offense, risk of future dangerousness, need for inpatient mental health, hospitalization, things like that.
How long did you work for the Bureau of Prisons?
I worked for the Bureau of Prisons, including my internship, 21 years.
And did you retire from the Bureau of Prisons?
I did at the end of 2011.
Did you prepare any sort of manuals for the Bureau of Prisons?
Yes, I was one of 4 psychologists in the Bureau of Prisons chosen to develop the forensic training manual. The Bureau of Prisons has multiple medical centers around the country, but they also have numerous other facilities, and many of those other facilities have forensic psychologists that do court studies. They're called satellite centers. And they wanted us to create a manual that could be then used for training new employees, new hires for the satellite centers on how to perform forensic evaluations. And also to then create some sense of uniformity in the way that the methods of how that evaluation is done.
And so briefly, what have you been doing since you retired in 2011?
Well, things have shifted a little bit here and there. Prior to me retiring, I was actually teaching at the Force Institute. So that continued after my retirement. And then I started in a private practice office in Springfield, Neuropsychological Associates. And I was working there until, doing my private consulting through that office. Then the Force Institute closed its doors. And so I switched my practice, one of my arms of practice, as you say, one of my settings, over to Citizens Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. And so I worked there in the neurology office and the Missouri Memory Center, where I evaluate issues of possible dementia and neurocognitive impairment in adults. And then I continue with my private consulting, although it's not through Neuropsych Associates. I realized I didn't necessarily need to have an office like that because my forensic neuropsychology consulting is throughout the country. I have cases in Alaska, Washington, D.C., Central Illinois, Texas, Indiana.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd request that Dr. Denney be allowed to testify in the area of forensic psychology and neuropsychology.
No objection. You approve. You will be permitted to testify.
In your work over the past couple decades, have you had an occasion to examine criminal defendants for the purpose of determining the effect of mental diseases upon their ability to have the state of mind required to be guilty of a crime?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell the jury a little bit about that process, how you go about doing that?
That's a very good question, because it's not necessarily intuitive. Because what you're trying to do is figure out a mental state that was in the past, right? So you can evaluate somebody now, but that doesn't necessarily answer what was going on back at a period in time. We call that a retrospective evaluation. So like for sanity or mental state at the time of crime, you have to incorporate additional information that you wouldn't normally do in a regular clinical examination. And I don't know how much detail you want me to get into.
Let me ask you this. So do you break up the areas you look at in a certain domains?
Well, that's a really good way to look at it, is to use a model. Rather than just zooming in there and evaluating somebody and trying to come up with some opinion, use a step-by-step methodical model as to how you gather information and connect it together. And so using this model, we've got information we learn that is contemporaneous, like right now, today, present time. Okay, so I would interview the person, so I get information from the person about their current mental status. I would also perform other tests and figure out, other contemporary things. That's what's all going on for this person right now. And those two things will then guide me to a pretty good understanding of what the person's current mental status is. Okay, so that's like one row across. Okay, but we have another row here in the middle of this mental state at the time of the alleged offense or whatever it is you're looking at in the past. And you have to obviously interview the person, ask them about their mental state at the time, but you also have to review collateral information, investigative reports, information, other people that were present at the time maybe that saw the behavior of the person, and you analyze what that behavior looks like. And then knowing that self-report and the other information, the objective information, what actually happened, and combining those two together can lead you to a clinical decision about what their mental state was like at that time. I'm sorry, I'll try to slow down. Then there's another row that is historical. Okay, you talk to the person about their history, how they grew up, what sort of issues were in their life, if they've had mental health conditions or issues or problems before. But then you also look at the collateral information there too. What do the records show? What do past hospitalizations show? When mental illness or mental problems manifested themselves in that history, what did they look like? And so then combining these two together give you a pretty good idea of what the person's health condition was like historically. Okay, so now we have 3 different rows, and we've got self-report here, we've got objective outside information that might include investigative materials or behavioral observations at past times, things like that, other people observing the person. And then we've got my clinical conclusions. And once you've got all 9 of these boxes filled in, then you can combine these two together and figure out what a mental state was like at the time of the offense, and then you can answer the question that the court poses, whether it's insanity or whatever the question, it's a retrospective competency or something. Does that make sense? So you have to combine each of these areas together, and then that guides you into a well-informed, reasonable conclusion about the mental state in the past.
Have you been published with regard to that model you just described?
Yes, I first published that model in 2000, and it's been published again in the mid-2000s, 2012, 2016.
Have you had the opportunity to examine the defendant, Nicholas Goodjohn?
Yes, I have.
Before we talk about your examination, can you tell the jury a little bit about the materials that you reviewed before doing that, or as part of that process?
I can if I look at my notes, because I wrote a report that lists all those things. There were way too many things for me to remember. Okay, that's a page and a half worth of things listed.
Let me just ask you about some things in general.
You don't really want me to go through it, thank you.
Did you review the charges in this case
Yes, I did,
and the probable cause statement?
of course.
And did you review the Green County Sheriff's Office case summary
Yes, I did,
and timeline
yes.
in the interview that
Check his email.
this
Well, you are leading a little bit, but it may expedite on.
they're really not substantive questions that we reviewed. Did you review interviews of people associated with the case?
Yes, I did. I interviewed 7 different individuals, or I read reports of interviews of 7 different individuals with the Greene County Sheriff's Office.
Did you review some surveillance videos of the defendant?
Yes, there were 3 surveillance videos that were Greene County related, but then there were also videos from Wisconsin that I reviewed as well.
Did you review Facebook messages between the defendant and Gypsy Blanchard?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Between the defendant and Allie Noble, Beth Destris, Aurora Jones, and Caitlin Lee?
Yes, I did.
Did you review the defendant's medical records and disability reports and the other materials reviewed by Dr. Franks?
Yes, I did.
Did you have an opportunity to review Dr. Franks' report?
Yes, I did, and his raw data as well.
What do you mean by raw data?
Raw data is the actual, like when we administer psychological testing, there's actually a protocol or a paper that goes with that where we write down answers and we write down scorings and things like that. And then total those numbers and come to conclusions from that. I reviewed that data as well.
I want to talk a little bit about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or DSM. Can you explain briefly what that is?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is a publication by the American Psychiatric Association. It is our diagnostic manual. It helps us classify different conditions. It's got the diagnostic criteria, what is a condition, what isn't the condition, whether there are severities in that condition, if there's multiple conditions that come together and create another condition. All of that's spelled out in the diagnostic manual. And it's sort of our Bible as far as diagnosis.
With regard to autism spectrum disorder, is that a mental disease in the DSM?
Yes, it is.
And can you tell us a little bit about what autism spectrum disorder is in general?
Well, autism spectrum disorder is really a concept that a person has impaired interactions with the environment, socially mostly. And within that umbrella, there's different characteristics that have changed a little bit over time based upon, changed in the sense that the classification of them has changed. But it's the condition itself, as I think you've heard, is a difficulty in social interaction that causes problems. You know, difficulty interacting with other people normally in a social way, but also a tendency towards repetitive, focused type of behaviors that become problematic. And then there's some other subcategories that other things you have to rule out. But basically those two features to identify something within the autism spectrum disorders, and then there's sub-classifications that, depending on other characteristics of the individual or other characteristics of the individual when they were a child, like up through 3 years of age, and how they behaved and how they learned, that would change that diagnosis a little bit. And they would all fall under the umbrella of autism spectrum. And it's a concept, if I may, that varies from very severe to very, very mild, and even to where it's so mild it's not necessarily considered a, quote, disorder, end quote, right? It's characteristics of a personality style. But we don't concern ourselves with those characteristics out here because they don't really cause significant problems in social or occupational functioning, right? So it's by definition not really a disorder. But there are people with those characteristics that are not considered autism spectrum disorder. And then, of course, then there's the very extreme.
So it's a little hard to picture, but can you help us picture what those ends of that spectrum look like?
Yes, well, let's zoom to the severe side of it, first of all, where you've got severe autism. These will often, what we think of as like children who, if anybody tries to touch them or console them or love on them, you care for them. They'll scream, they'll bite, they kick, they'll bang their head, they'll react to the stimuli of somebody trying to engage them socially. And when you back off and leave them alone, they settle down. And it can be so severe that they self-harm, they'll bite chunks of flesh out of themselves, they'll bang their head, and tremendously maladapt in the severest form. On the other extent of this autism spectrum are characteristics that aren't pathological, but they're odd. Okay? When we think of an absent-minded professor or the person who has awkward social interaction skills, but otherwise they're functioning well, they have some relationships that are good, and they're able to maintain a vocation, maybe a stellar career. And so we just think of them as odd kind of people. Okay, then somewhere here there's a line between, well, now it's impacting their social or malfunctioning, causing impairments, causing some job problems, things like that. So now it's probably a disorder, okay? But it's very mild. And then there's more moderate, and then there's severe. Does that make sense?
So it's a very broad spectrum, it sounds like. How many different levels of classification are there officially?
Well, officially based upon DSM, there's 3. There's some research classifications that make that broader, and some of our research tools, start measuring people in the non-impaired ranges, right, for those characteristics. But for the diagnostic and statistical manual, there's 3 basic levels.
And historically, we've already heard there was something called Asperger's syndrome.
Yes.
So if I was previously diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and had this change in the manual, is my condition somehow different?
Your condition is exactly the same. Okay. The change in the nomenclature, just because we went from diagnostic and statistical manual number 4 up to number 5, didn't change the condition at all. It just changed the way it's labeled. And so Asperger's being a very mild form of autism, it used to be a separate diagnosis because the characteristics are uniquely enough different than regular autism. But then in 2013, they came out with a new manual. They said, well, we're going to lump all these together under autism spectrum disorders. And we'll call them all autism, and we'll level them, level 1, level 2, and level 3. So Asperger's is subsumed under the title autism, but it would be level 1.
And I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, but based on your review of the defendant's records, do you agree with his historical diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome?
Yes, I do.
And can you explain why that is?
Well, yes, I can. And to be fair, if we can't just say that, because his history started out with autism when he was younger. Because one of the things that would classify a condition as autism for young children is not only the communication problem and the perseverative kind of rote behaviors, collecting things, playing with things in an odd way, repetitive behaviors, but also delay in language functioning or general cognitive functioning. If the person had those delays as well, then it would be considered autism. If they did not have the language delays or overwhelming cognitive delays, then it was considered Asperger's. Okay, so that's the key difference there. And back then, when Mr. Dragojian was very young, there were indications of delayed language functioning at young ages. And so he was diagnosed with autism. Then once he reached high school, those areas caught up. So they were no longer relevant to his condition per se. And they fell away, which then changed the classification over to Asperger's, right? Changed the diagnosis to Asperger's, right? And we don't know exactly why there was that delay there. Could have been a delay but either way, he caught up. And so it was Asperger's. And I agree with that diagnosis at the time. I think it was correct.
Just talk a little bit more about his history. What was his history with regard to vocational rehabilitation?
Well, while he was in high school, he was in a program that included job placements. Okay. And so he'd be in classes, but then he would leave classes and go work somewhere as a helper or doing some sort of work type behavior in a cafe or something like that. And he did that some. And then after he finished with high school, he was involved with the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation to at least get enrolled there and have them facilitate a program of vocation for him. In between those events, he also worked at the pizza place for a while where he was waving the sign out.
And was he approved for a program of schooling with the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation?
My recollection of reviewing those records is yes, he was. He wanted to get into computer, IT things, computer science, And they were really pushing him more into the culinary arts, working in kitchens and things like that. And he finally said, yes, I'll do that. And then in the time it took before the program actually started, he then called him and said, nah, I'm not going to.
So we've talked about his history a little bit, and we've heard a little bit about his history. I'd like to talk now about the present that you mentioned. Did you have an opportunity to examine it?
I did.
Can you talk to the jury about that process in general and what that examination consists of?
Sure. I examined him over 3 settings, January 25, 26, and February 2nd of 2017. It was a thorough evaluation that included about 4 hours of interviewing him face-to-face in private, and then about 11 hours of testing over those 3 days.
Can you describe your interaction with the defendant in general?
Yes. He was alert and oriented and in no acute distress. He was not upset or frustrated. He was reasonably pleasant. At first, he was reserved and rather cool toward me. As the interview progressed over a number of hours and then over a couple of days, he became more jovial and more relaxed in his interaction with me. I would say his affect was jovial, that is his moody sort of presentation. It was reasonably friendly. He had better eye contact with me than I thought he was going to. It did not seem particularly abnormal. I mean, he would look at me and he would look down, we would talk, and he would look at me. It's unusual to stare at somebody, right? It's also unusual to never look at them. His eye contact was actually pretty reasonable, I thought. Well, better as the time went on than it was up front, of course.
You've seen the days in surveillance videos at the counter there?
Yes, I have.
Eye contact similar that he makes to the clerk there?
Yes, he made when I was reviewing that, it looked like he made reasonable eye contact, as best you can tell from that angle, but also the social dynamic between the two. The woman behind the counter and he were both chuckling at the same issues, whether it be his bottle of root beer, or whether his hair, whatever, they were chuckling together.
What were your observations about the Greyhound bus station surveillance video?
The thing that I thought was interesting about the Greyhound bus surveillance video are a couple things, actually. There was the one where he came up to the counter to get the ticket initially. And the plan was, he's already had a ticket for return, they just needed to add another seat. And he was at the counter, and the person presumably tells him, well, there's no more seats. Okay, so we got to do something different. And then he gets cash back, and they change this, and he purchases another ticket. What's striking to me is that he did not blow up. He did not react angry or frustrated or which is something that would be very common with somebody with autism who would have a problem with change, especially last minute and in a potentially stressful environment. And he didn't do that. He responded to that flexibly, I thought. The other thing that was striking to me was the other scene where they're waiting in a line to go up to the ticket person to check tickets and ID or whatever, and then points them to go get on the bus. They waited in this line of people. I don't remember how many it was, but it had to be 15, 20, maybe more people in this line. And you could watch them working their way up patiently. They didn't react negatively to that. They waited patiently, got up to the front, processed the tickets, and then went on. I thought that was striking too, that he didn't have a negative reaction of being surrounded by people in that line.
Did he exhibit social behaviors in that video at Greyhound that you saw between him and Gypsy?
That's true. Because you could see where they got in and out of the cab and would walk in and walk the other way. He would hold the door for her. When they walked by on the sidewalk, he was leading, she was following. It looked very normal.
You had the opportunity to watch the interview of the defendant with Detective Mahola.
Yes, I did.
Any observations about his eye contact with her?
From the way I looked at it, I mean, what it appeared to me is that he had reasonable eye contact given the stressful environment, the stressful situation. I didn't see that as being particularly abnormal. So,
I'd like to talk about the testing you did some.
yes.
Why do you engage in psychological testing?
Well, it's one of the boxes, right? This is the easy answer. It's another box. It's more objective. Right? I can talk with somebody and say, wow, this person seemed really, really sharp, or this person doesn't seem quite as sharp as they should be. That's my own internal sense of where things lie. If I give objective psychological testing, then I can see how the person performs, and I can compare those scores to norms of the population. I can say, okay, not only do I feel like this person is functioning at this level, but these tests can identify strengths and weaknesses relative to the normal population in other areas that are much finer and more detailed than I can pick up just talking with or doing some non-formal sort of procedures with them. So I used structured objective tests. Plus, the key there is they're objective. They're not going to be biased so much by my own sense of what I think I want to see in the data. The data are what the data are.
How do you choose what tests to get?
Well, I knew with Mr. Godejohn specifically, I knew that there was a record with the presumed conclusion that he had some condition inside the autism spectrum. And so I went in thinking that might very well be the case. And if that's the case, it's important to identify what cognitive strengths the person has and cognitive weaknesses the person has, because there are differences. Just because you have this label, umbrella label, doesn't mean it's all the same. Everybody's different. And I wanted to measure his focused attention, concentration, speed of mental processing. I wanted to measure his learning and memory, how well he learns new things verbally, how well he learns things visually. And then I also wanted to measure his executive function, that is his problem solving, mental flexibility, abstract reasoning, both verbal and nonverbal. And I wanted to measure some academic functioning, like reading, writing, arithmetic. And of course, I wanted to include tests that would give me IQ scores as well.
Let's talk about IQ testing a little bit, if you would. Is that just sort of get that full-scale IQ score, and that's the be-all, end-all of what your intellectual functioning is, or does it work somehow differently than that?
It can be the end-all, be-all in some cases, although that's probably short-sighted to consider it that way. Because, as you know, somebody with a very high IQ may have a stellar functional life and do brilliant things. Or somebody with a very high IQ may still be making coffee at Starbucks. There's more to it than just an IQ number. But that IQ number can be a good summary of a person's overall cognitive function if each of the areas inside that basket of cognition, attention, concentration, learning, memory, abstract reasoning, all those things, are all relatively uniform. Okay? Because the IQ score is like an average in a way. It combines all of this together into one summary indicator. But if you've got big differences inside the basket between real good strengths and really, really poor weaknesses, then one summary indicator is not a very good summary of that person. And so you have to look at the strengths and weaknesses. And there's some rules that will guide us as to what makes a good summary indicator and what does not.
Is it unusual for someone on the autism spectrum to have that difference in the different parts of the IQ test?
Actually, that's very, very common. There's repeated research that demonstrates that individuals in the autism spectrum have striking strengths and weaknesses, and oftentimes they fall in the same patterns, which is what we would expect. For example, with Asperger's, a mild form of autism, the difficulties are in language function, right? Actually, the difficulty is not in language function so much. In autism, the language is delayed, right? In classic autism. In the Asperger's mild form of it, their language is strong. It's their nonverbal interaction and the nonverbal problem solving that tends to be worse. And that comes across in the IQ tests, where you'll see a very strong language index, like a verbal comprehension index, and a very weak speed of mental processing, for example, where it measures how fast the brain processes information. It's such a common pattern that there's research, like even in 2016, in the Journal of Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, where it says you should look at the indices in IQ testing with people with autism spectrum, because you're going to see this split. That's the way it comes out, and you should not rely on the overall IQ summary, because it's not a good indicator of their genuine intelligence, because they'll be very slow in speed of mental processing, because almost all of them are. That's just a common deficit.
We heard a little bit about where someone would fall in terms of percentiles based on these tests. Is there something that would be helpful to you to kind of demonstrate to the jury where these scores fall against norms in our?
Yes, actually, because I've heard quite a bit of talk about percentiles, and percentiles are different than percent correct. It's very different, and people oftentimes get confused with the nature of percentiles. So it's all based upon a bell-shaped curve. Okay, IQ is a bell-shaped curve. Our other cognitive functions like concentration, learning, and memory are all bell-shaped curve. And so we can see what it looks like to be in the normal range and what's in the abnormally high range and the abnormally low range.
Let me show you what I've marked in this case exhibit 184. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
Is that something you think that would assist you in explaining this to the jury?
Yes.
In general, what is it?
It's the bell-shaped curve with the IQ scores placed on there.
Move the case exhibit 184 as a demonstrative exhibit.
No objection.
To be received. So if you would just briefly explain what we're looking at and how it relates to IQ score. Let me pull that up. Judge, may he step down so he needs some quicker.
Thank you. I have a pointer even. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to use it. Okay, so this is the bell-shaped curve. And the way this works, these are IQ scores along the bottom. Okay. And the height of the curve is, as you see, frequency in the population. These are norms. Okay, it's the normal population. It's the average population. It's the typical population, right, for IQ. And this is the way it comes out year after year. What we have is with IQ scores, we all know an IQ of 100 is average, right? That's the average. Well, this is what it means. It's the average. It's the most common score. And all of the scores cluster around that score, okay? And so then we, the professionals have looked at this and said, okay, well, let's try to define what is average, what is above average, and what is below average, okay? And they basically said, we're going to classify in broad terms, average is within one standard deviation. Okay, without boring you too much, a standard deviation basically is the average difference from the mean, okay? It's like average of the differences. And so one standard deviation with an IQ test in this direction going higher on the scale is up to 115, okay? Well, one standard deviation going lower than the mean of 100 is 85, because the standard deviation in an IQ test is 15. Does that make sense? So within this band of one standard deviation, we have 68% of the population falls in that range. In other words, for IQs, 68% of the general population, their IQ falls within one standard deviation, either above or below it. That's called average, okay? Now, the classifications get sliced up a little bit different here and there, and I'm on a panel, actually, that was seated.
There's not a question.
I'm sorry.
The prosecutor wants to ask a question, I would ask that we do so, just to let
I
him
did
talk.
ask him to orient us to the chart, which I think he's doing, but,
I think we're oriented.
okay. So, for example, we heard something about, like, if I were in the 16th percentile, sounds really low if I'm thinking in terms of 90A, 80B, 70C, right? Where would I be on the bell curve if I were at the 16th percentile?
The 16th percentile is right here at 85. Because from 100 down to 85, one standard deviation, there's actually 34% of the population falls in this range, and 34% from 50%, which is 50% here, right? 50% of the population below, 50% of the population above. That brings you down to this line right here, and this is the 16th percentile. So if you notice, 14% fall here, 2% fall here, and a little bitty fraction falls there. And so basically 16% falls down here. So if I had a score that was at the 16th percentile, my score falls right here. If we're talking IQ, I'm as bright as 16% of the population, or as bright or brighter than 16% of the population.
And
But
consider
there's more
average.
that is brighter than I am. But it's still considered average. You consider it low average.
What do you consider scores in the blue area to the left?
Right here. Okay. These are what would be called, well, see, here's where I was starting to say it depends on the classification system. Basically, this is, with IQ scores, typically they call, and I'm sorry, it gets confusing.
Judge, I'm going to object. He was asked what it was. He's now talking about something else. I would ask the witness to answer the question the prosecutor asked him, not what he wants to talk about.
System. Keep informing the question.
Would you explain what the blue area means?
Yes, the classification for this area includes below average and borderline classifications.
Tell us what you mean by that. How are those two things different, below average and borderline?
Well, some classifications overlap on this line. They call it below average. This area here, they classically called borderline. It's not truly impaired, but it's well below typical.
And where would something consistent with an intellectual disability fall?
Intellectual disability, or what was formerly known as mental retardation, classically an IQ of 70 or below, although there's some flexibility around that.
You had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Frank's testimony, correct? You might go ahead and. Did you identify any issues with his analysis of the IQ score?
He relied on the full-scale IQ summary indicator when he really should not have.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, there's clear guidance that when we interpret IQ testing, that we look at the amount of scatter in the indexes underneath the test, the verbal comprehension index, perceptual reasoning index, working memory, processing speed, things like that. And if there's too much deviation, too much variability in those scores, then this is not a good summary indicator. There's another summary indicator you should use instead, which gives us a better overall assessment of what this person's intellectual ability is.
And what is that measure?
The general ability index.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, it's a measure of intelligence, but without the speed of mental processing or what's called working memory in it. And so it gives you a more robust picture of the balance between visual thinking skills, and verbal thinking skills. And it combines those two without the effect of the very slow processing speed. And it gives you a better sense of what the IQ should be, but for that very slow processing speed.
Did you rescore Dr. Frank's scoring on the IQ test?
Yes, I did.
Did you find any errors?
I did.
Did you arrive at different composite scores then?
Yes, there were multiple errors in his scoring that changed the IQ scores, the indices scores a little bit. His original, it basically changed the verbal comprehension index, raised it from a 96 to a 100. And then it changed the full scale IQ from an 82 to an 84.
It didn't change the descriptive nature of those measures, so did it?
No, 82 and 84 are both in the low average range, and 96 and 100 are both in the average range, there by 100.
And what range did his perceptual reasoning index fall in?
His perceptual reasoning index was 90, and the score changes I did didn't change that number, so it was still 90, which is right up there in the average range.
And when you computed his general ability index based on Dr. Frank's scoring, what did that show you?
The general ability index was a 95, right beneath 100 in the average range.
So what does that mean to us?
That means if you don't consider the speed of mental processing, which is affected by motor speed, and you just think about what the person's conceptual intelligence is like, problem solving, planning, organizing, understanding the world, word definitions, things like that. If you just look at that, that score tells us what his general thinking skills are like, not including the slow motor speed. And with that general ability index of 95, it falls in it falls in the average range.
You also administered an IQ test,
Yes, I did.
the same test,
Yes, I did.
and did you obtain some different scores?
Yes, the scores I obtained were statistically significantly lower than the scores obtained by Dr. Franks.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I have to say statistically significantly different because these scores are not perfect, right? There's error in them. All of our tests have error, but we know what that error is, and we know how often a score, let's say we obtained a general ability index of 95. Okay, our score is 95, but what's the true score that nobody really knows? Okay, well, it's somewhere around 95, and we can statistically identify how accurate this 95 is. Okay, so my bottom line is they fluctuate a little bit because of error. Well, I had to know whether the difference between Dr. Frank's testing and my lower scores when I tested him were just because of chance error, because the scores fluctuate a little bit. And so I ran the publisher's scoring program to identify whether those scores were just part of random variation or whether they were statistically significantly different. And they were statistically significantly different. Lower than they should have been, given Dr. Frank's testing.
So did you go back and try to determine what might account for that in the testing?
I did. I went back and looked at the items that were different between Dr. Frank's testing and my testing. I mean, the item was the same, but his answers were different. Like on some questions, he knew the right answer when Dr. Franks asked him that question, but when I asked him that very same question later, he said he didn't know the answer. And so that caused him to have a lower score. And for example, one of them would have been something like, this is not an actual item, but it's something just like one of the items. What's the name of the royalty in France that lost her head in a revolution. Right? Well, that person's name might be the answer to the question, for example. And so it was that kind of question that he knew the answer to then, but he didn't know it when I asked him.
And what was the full scale IQ you came up with in your test?
The full scale IQ that he achieved when I tested him was 77.
And where would that fall in terms of?
Yeah, 77 would fall right about here, and that would be considered borderline range.
And what about the general ability index when you consider that in your test?
That was an 81. So my general ability index came out at 81, which is right here, which is in the below average, low average, below average, not quite borderline zone there.
Did you diagnose him with an intellectual disability?
No,
Why not?
because his scores don't support intellectual disability. Even the IQ of 77 does not support an intellectual disability. It's too high.
What other kinds of testing did you do?
I did a broad array of neuropsychological testing, where I went beyond just the IQ cluster of tests. I measured a broader perspective of his attention, concentration, learning, memory, abstract reasoning, judgment, problem solving.
And so, can you tell us a little bit about what those tests tell you about his reasoning and decision-making ability?
Yes, I can, if I may refer to my notes, because I don't want to incorrectly report it. That testing that I gave was called the neuropsychological assessment battery. Battery is a fancy word for a cluster of tests. Okay, so the NAB for ease of use. And there's different modules inside the NAB that measure different things. Did you ask me what the scores were or how we
No,
performed?
what I'd like you to do is tell us what those tests told you. For example, you were here when Dr. Franks told us that his diagnosis meant that he would have difficulty with any cognitive decision-making or reasoning. So what do those tests you gave show in that regard?
The tests I gave in that regard that measure reasoning and such, again, we can slice up reasoning in many different ways. There's attention and concentration. Well, there's an attention index. Well, first of all, the overall battery, the NAB battery, has a summary indicator that can be used. And that summary indicator there came out at 87. So that would have fallen right about here in the low average range. And then inside the battery, there are modules, 5 of them. The attention module measures focused attention and speed of mental processing. And that index standard score was 66. Okay, way down there, that's pretty impaired, but it includes the speed of mental processing and attention. And then there's the language index, language skills, comprehensive language, expressive language, things like that. And his score was 111. Okay, that's up here. So that's clearly a strength for him, his verbal skills, verbal comprehension, verbal understanding, and communicating. Then on the memory index, which measures learning and memory, the ability to retain new information, both visually and verbally, the overall index there was 91, which we can see would be right in here somewhere, 91. And the percentile there would have been the 27th percentile, which is an average, low average range. And then spatial index, another module, spatial reasoning, spatial processing, as opposed to language, nonverbal sort of reasoning. That came out at 87, which is in the low average range as well. And then the executive functions, the last module is called executive function, which measures verbal and nonverbal problem solving, judgment, abstract reasoning, things like that. And his score was 97, with a percentile ranking of 42, which, is right up here. It's in the average range.
You heard Dr. Franks refer to a couple of judgment questions that he asked the defendant. You just mentioned judgment was part of this battery of tests you gave. Is there a specific section on that?
There is actually, inside the executive module, there's a subtest called judgment. And it is a verbal reasoning, problem-solving type of subtest.
And how do you do on that subtest?
Let me get the score of that real quick. His judgment score came out at the 97th percentile. And actually, with the way these subtests are classified, it's a little different. I need to explain that,
Okay,
if I may.
sure.
We talked about IQ scores with a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Well, sorry, but the NAB battery.
You can be seated, that's.
I'm sorry.
You're not lecturing.
The NAB battery doesn't classify the scores based upon this IQ metric. It uses a different scale called T-scores. And with a T-score, then the average is 50, okay? And the standard deviation is 10. Okay, so now, so the mean for a T-score would be right here, but instead of calling it 100, it would call it 50. And this would be 60, 70, and 80, and then this would be 40, 30. So, but it's the same curve. It just has a different scale on it. And so his result on the judgment subtest was a T-score of 69, which is almost 2 standard deviations above the mean, which would be 1, 2, is right here. It was better than, and his percentile ranking was 97th percentile. It was better than the judgment of 97% of the average population.
I'm going to show you what I've marked as case exhibit 186. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
What is it?
This is the actual testing protocol for the judgment subtest.
And so does it contain questions and the answers he gave on that?
Yes, it's got the questions and my writing of his answers.
Move to admit case exhibit 186.
I just briefly saw it, Judge. I don't know, I didn't get to read it.
Why don't you take a look at it?
Take a look at it real quick.
Take your time, you don't have to look at it.
I have no objection, Judge.
Let me receive it, no objection.
Could you please read the questions and then the answers the defendant gave?
Okay. All of them?
Yes, please.
Okay. The first one is, why should you blow out candles before going to bed? His answer was, because you don't want to start a fire. Each of these questions is scored based upon a 0, 1, or 2. Except for the first one, which is just a 1-point score, and that's a right score. The next one, why should you not leave a young child alone at home? His answer, because they might get into some things that are hazardous to their health. And then at that point, since it was a vague response, I was supposed to question it. And so I have a question here saying, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about it. And then he said, they can't have, or they can't fend for themselves, so they may starve. Okay, that's the 2-point response. Again, number 3, why should you replace the batteries in a smoke detector regularly? His response, so you can rely on the smoke detector when there is a fire. So you don't have to worry about the detector being dead, because it could also be you that is dead because of it. Awkward, but it's got the content. That is a 2-point response. Next question, what should you do if you take too much of a prescription medication? His answer, Call Poison Control Center and let them know your situation. It's an immediate response and a 2-point response because it's the appropriate thing to do. Number 5, why should you not unplug electrical appliances while your hands are wet? His response, because you could get zapped, because water is a conductor of electricity and it increases the chance of you getting zapped. 2-point response. Number 6, why are certain foods marked with an expiration date? His response, so the customer knows when to leave the product with, sorry, my writing's not good. Leave the product with an old expiration to get a product with a newer expiration date so you don't get sick. The concept there is that the expiration date helps inform us as to whether the food might be good or whether we would become ill, which is a 2-point response. Next one, 7, why is it important for people to brush their teeth? His response, to keep your teeth as clean as possible and to keep your gums as healthy as possible. That answer addressed 2 issues, hygiene and keeping away disease, and freshness of breath type issues, so it's a 2-point response. Number 8, why is it important to tell your doctor all the medications that you are taking? His response, you should tell your doctor because there could be serious side effects that would cause serious life changes, and he could give you an alternative route or medication that could improve your condition. Again, 2-point response. Number 9, why should you wash your hands before eating? This response, because it is good hygiene and it keeps you from spreading any diseases onto the food. It addresses not only the hygiene issue, but also the transfer of germs. 2-point response. Number 10, the last one. What does it mean when your doctor says that there is a 25% chance of having serious side effects from a treatment? His response, I'm sorry, I can't read the first word that I wrote. You should put that 25% chance into perspective of whether or not that medication is good for you over another medication. It means it has a 25% chance of having life-changing side effects. That's not a perfect answer. It's a 1-point answer. It's a splitting the difference answer. 1 point rather than 2 words.
Did you find the defendant to be intellectually impaired?
I did not.
Why not?
All of his scores, even his historical IQ scores, some of them are low, yes. But even going back to his childhood scores in the record, none of them fell in the range of intellectual disability. The fact is, the objective data does not support intellectual impairment. Mr. Godejohn does not have intellectual disability.
We've spoken briefly about how it's common for individuals who are on the autism spectrum to have those higher scores in the reasoning part of the IQ test, but the lower scores in the processing speed. Are you familiar with any studies that have looked at the autism population with regard to their intuitive versus methodical decision making?
Yes, actually, there is research. You combine speed of mental processing in with methodical, which goes together because when somebody's methodical about their decision making, the speed of mental processing slows. And there's 2 papers that come to mind, both of them published in the Journal of Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. One showing that on IQ tests, the speed of mental processing is very low. And so it's telling you, do not use the regular IQ score because it gives you wrong results because of that. the other paper, I think it was 2016, would actually measure autism spectrum, the construct, using the same instrument actually that I used and that Dr. Franks used, the adult autism scale, the autism quotient. It's a subscale in that. And they gave it to lots of different people and then measured their level of autistic thinking using that scale, and also their ability to reason and the way they reason with another scale. Now, this scale measures methodical, deliberate, step-by-step type of reasoning, but it also measures intuitive, snap judgment kind of reasoning. They're different. And they found in this research that as the level of autistic thinking in the person increases, the more they have methodical, step-by-step thinking, and the less they have intuitive, snap judgment. It was fascinating research.
Does that deal with that awkwardness in social settings where if I have autism, I may not know how to react to things that present themselves right to me, as opposed to if I have more time to think about it, I can make a better decision?
Yes. Yeah, and when there's no time limits, for example, where I'm asking him these questions, there was no particular time limit. It wasn't under the gun time limit-wise. He could think through it and give me an answer. That's deliberate, methodical type of reasoning, which is very different than an impulsive, intuitive, I gotta have an answer right now. People with autism spectrum traits are not very good at the spontaneous, quick change type decision making, but they're actually reasonably good with methodical step-by-step thinking.
Did you reach a diagnosis with regard to the defendant?
Yes, I did.
What was it?
Autism spectrum disorder, mild or level 1, I should say. And also, because his reading level is not up to what I think it probably should be, and his math skills aren't quite what they ought to be, I diagnosed specific learning disability for reading and specific learning disability for math.
And does the DSM give us specific examples of what a level 1, 2, and 3 could look like?
Yes.
And would using that assist you in explaining your diagnosis to the jury?
Yes, it would. Certainly the level part of it.
You recognize Gypsy Rose 185?
Yes,
Is that chart from the DSM that explains the levels?
yes, this is a copy right out of the diagnostic manual that talks about how to rate the severity of autism spectrum disorder.
Move to admit Stacy Stewart 185 as a demonstrative exhibit.
Objection.
So that's what the chart looks like there, correct? Did you say objection?
I said no objection.
I'm sorry, I think you said objection, I was waiting. Sorry, you didn't without objection. So that's the chart in its entirety, and it's kind of small, and so at the bottom is level 1, correct?
Yes.
And as I look at that, the 3 levels, all 3 levels require some support, correct?
Yes, because that's the nature of the diagnosis, right? If the person didn't require some level of support, they wouldn't have a diagnosis. They would just be quirky. Okay, that's this group out here that doesn't have impairment at some level and needs some support. That would meet the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder.
And the defendant's definitely not level 3, correct?
Correct, that's the most severe.
So if we look at levels 1 and 2, in addition to talking about what the deficits are, it gives us an example, correct?
Yes, the severity levels on the left, and then the social communication examples are in the middle, and then the restrictive repetitive behavior kind of examples are on the right.
So level 2 is described, for example, as a person who speaks in simple sentences, but whose interaction is limited to narrow special interests. What does that mean to you, narrow special interests?
Well, that's when they do speak in simple sentences, it's almost always on their area of interest. Let's say somebody was really focused on collecting baseball cards. That's their big interest, right? They can talk to you in simple sentences, but it's always going to come back to their baseball cards because that's what they're really, really interested in. So there'll be simple sentences that always slide back into their narrow area of special interest.
And what about who has markedly odd nonverbal communication? What does that mean to you?
Okay, that's the other aspect of their communication. The nonverbal is odd, but it's not just odd, it's markedly odd. Okay, that's the term there. Okay, so it's more than just odd, it's got to be a lot of odd, okay, in their nonverbal interaction.
Does that describe the defendant?
Does this appear?
Yeah, that example for number 2, level 2?
I don't think so, because the person speaks in simple sentences and always goes back to their narrow focus of interest, which is not my perspective, Mr. Godejohn.
With regard to level 1, it describes a person who's able to speak in full sentences, engage in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fails. What does that part mean, that to or fro conversation with others fails?
It's the dynamic of conversation, which we all know is a give and take. Person speaks a little bit and then they rest, and the next person speaks a little bit and it rests, and it's a dynamic process, and we can feel it when it's going right. And we're talking with somebody, and if somebody doesn't work with you there and it becomes disjointed and awkward, it's difficult to communicate with somebody like that. And that's what it's talking about, is engaging in communication whose to and fro conversation fails. It disrupts.
And whose attempts to make friends are odd or typically unsuccessful.
Yes.
So which of those 2 more accurately describes the defendant in your opinion?
In my professional opinion, the box here example for level 1 is more accurate reflection of Mr. Godejohn, based upon the available information I've reviewed and seen.
We talked about the history part of the model. Let's talk about the present part of the model, looking at the testing and diagnosis and interaction with the defendant by you.
By model, I'm sorry if I may ask, you mean the model of how to determine a mental state in the past?
Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you.
So we talked about history with regard to that.
Yes,
And we've talked about the present, which is your evaluation of the defendant, meeting with him, talking to him, testing him,
that's correct.
and your diagnosis, correct?
Yes.
Which leads to the time of offense part. So in your training and experience, if you're looking at that time before and at the time of the offense, what would be important to look at to determine what a person was thinking at that retrospective time?
Well, the model has 2 columns there. One is self-report. And so it's important for me to talk to the person about their perceptions of what happened and what they were thinking at the time. Granted, that self-report, it may be accurate or it may not be accurate, because I also have to look at this column, which is the other collateral sources of information that relate to that specific period of time. And it may be interviews of people that were there. It may be investigative materials. It may be the defendant's own writings at the time, maybe a journal or letters or electronic letters, text messages, things like that. But that's at the moment in time, and it's objective about their thinking at that time. So I take what the person tells me, I take this other objective information and I look at that. And how well does it fit? If it fits in the bigger picture and it all makes sense. And then I can come to a conclusion about his mental state at the time, whether there's indication of psychosis or delusions or brain injury kind of problems or cognitive problems, what have you. And then once I have these conclusions from past, present, and a specific period of time, say at the time of the alleged offense, once I know all of that, then I can answer the question that the court has asked me to answer.
And so would that include looking at things like perhaps a person told a psychologist to ask them what they were thinking at the time?
Yes, if it was relatively close to that period of time, yes.
Facebook messages a person may have sent leading up to or at the time of the event?
Exactly, I would look at that.
Web searches someone may have made leading up to or around the time of the event?
Yes, that can be
It
informed.
doesn't object these are the fact that asking leading questions.
Keep it. So it's,
Would it be important to look at the kinds of things the person was doing and saying at or near the time of the offense and coming up with that retrospective look?
It's not only important, it's absolutely critical. If you don't do that, you won't get a good understanding of what the person's thinking was at the time. You'll get maybe what they told you, and you can, as a psychologist, spin a lot of psychological theory about trying to explain that. But if you don't look at this stuff, you're not going to understand what was really going on at the time. Yes, it's vitally important.
No further questions?
folks, we're trying to hopefully get through one witness before we conclude for the night. And I'm not holding you Mr. Perry to what we talked about, but does everyone think they could go another 30 or 35 minutes? Is there anyone who really doesn't feel like they can go on today? Randy, you don't think you can?
No, I'm thinking of his face.
Oh.
Sorry.
Now would be the time to tell me. Does anyone need a break for 5 minutes just to stretch, or why don't we, okay, well, let's take a break for a couple minutes. Get something else to drink. I have to provide you rights, as always, I know. I should just tattoo it on my head. The court again reminds you of what you were told at the first recess of the court. Until you retire to consider your verdict, you must not discuss this case among yourselves or with others, or permit anyone to discuss it in your hearing. You should not form or express any opinion about the case until it is finally given to you to decide. Do not do any research or investigation on your own about any matter regarding this case or anyone involved with the trial. Do not communicate with others about the case by any means. Do not read, view, or listen to any newspaper, radio, electronic communication from the internet, or television reporting the trial. About 5 minutes? All right. About 5 minutes, okay. Dr. You can step down if you want, stretch a little bit, so you just go there when we get down.
There you go.
All right, so about 5 minutes or so. Mr. Good, how do you need to use your restroom? Are you good? Andy? You can come back. You can't have him go by himself. So you're on my way to go back. Do you have water to drink?
Yeah, have a water.
That would be nice. I should probably also.
All righty. Please be seated. Well, good morning. When we left everyone yesterday, we were about ready to do the cross-examination of Dr. Denney. Is that correct?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Perry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to catch you on that. Are you ready?
We are ready.
Dr. Denney, would you resume the stand, please? have a seat. I want to again remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Judge. Dr. Denney, how many people with autism spectrum disorder have you evaluated?
Oh, a handful, maybe 3, 4, or 5, not very many.
Does the 3 to 5 include Mr. Godijan?
Yes, it does.
How much were you paid for your evaluation that you conducted for the state?
I was contracted to up to $6,000 for the evaluation. That does not include my time thus far in the actual trial.
So that would be $6,000 just to do the evaluations, the testing, the report, the interviews,
And reviewing all of the records.
and reviewing the records. How much were you paid for today's testimony, and yesterday's testimony?
I haven't totaled it up, but it's $150 an hour.
How much were you paid to prepare for today's testimony?
So it's the same hourly rate. And I think I had maybe 3 hours of record review.
Do you know altogether how much you've been paid by the state of Missouri for this work?
Well, I've been paid $6,000, as I said.
Now, you indicated that you had performed several tests with Mr. Godijan. Is that true?
Yes,
And if I counted right, I counted 16 tests in what you called structured interviews. Is that about right?
well, I would have to look. I had it listed in my report.
I found it on the second page of your report.
Yes, that is correct.
And do all of these tests in your mind help you determine your diagnosis?
Well, they assist. They certainly inform the diagnosis.
You also indicated that you read a lot of police reports
Yes, I did.
in your preparation for this evaluation. Is that correct?
Yes,
And among the things you reviewed, among other things, you reviewed a case summary.
yes.
Do you remember what that was?
The Greene County case summary?
Yeah.
Yes, it's an overview of the facts of the case.
You reviewed a case timeline.
Yes,
You reviewed, among other things, an interview of Gypsy Blanchard.
yes,
You reviewed some reports of 2 cab drivers.
yes, that's true.
You reviewed some reports of some Gypsy Blanchard posts that she made on ChristianDatingForFree.com.
Yes, that is true.
You reviewed the felony information in this case.
Yes,
And you reviewed a proposed instruction with the mental elements of the murder charge. Is that correct?
yes, I did.
And then a lot of other stuff. A lot of other interviews of family members and friends and stuff, people that knew Mr. Godijan,
Yes,
and some Facebook messages.
yes, many Facebook messages.
Now, you also indicated that you had been a staff psychologist for the FedMed for 8 years.
Well, actually, I was working in the forensic evaluation unit for 8 years. I was actually at the U.S. Medical Center for 21 years.
But 8 of those years was in doing evaluations.
Well, no, all the time I was doing evaluations. When in 2000, after 8 years, I moved off of the forensic evaluation unit and then started working in the medical and surgical units. However, I was the only neuropsychologist in the institution. And so when forensic cases came into the forensic unit that had neurologic issues or memory complaints or cognitive impairments, then I was a consultant to that. So then I would evaluate the pretrial defendants as well. So I continued evaluating pretrial defendants, just not at the same rate as I did when I was on the forensic unit itself.
And while there, you performed pretrial criminal forensic exams when they were court ordered,
Yes, sir.
and that would be by a U.S. judge.
Yes, a U.S. District Court.
And in the last, I guess, 8 years or so, since you've been in private practice, how many evaluations have you conducted?
hundreds and hundreds of evaluations, but not, unless you're asking specific forensic evaluations.
Forensic evaluation, but
That's
be
different.
specific, I apologize.
I have done not a lot because my clinical practice is my primary activity now, but my forensic work, maybe 15 cases.
And are those mostly competency to stand trial evaluations?
I would not say mostly. Most of the cases I get involved in are actually capital murder cases. I get pulled in to evaluate the defendant at various different times in the process, mostly to identify whether they had intellectual disability or any other significant cognitive problems. But there have been 3 or 4 that were competency related, I believe.
Now, you indicated that you evaluated Mr. Godejohn, correct?
Yes,
And you interviewed him for 135 minutes on January 25th, 2017? Would that be right? Page 14 of your report, I think you got that.
that sounds about right. Oh, yes, yes,
And you interviewed him then on the next day, the 26th of January, for 18 minutes?
yes,
And then on the 2nd of February, I'm guessing about a week later, you interviewed him for another 115 minutes.
that was the very next Monday. And yes, 115 minutes.
So that's the amount of time you spent just interviewing him.
Yes, I believe that's about 4 hours.
And then you tested him with these tests that you've talked about?
Yes, sir.
And that was on all 3 days. You did some testing on all 3 days, correct?
Yes, sir.
And of the 17 hours that you've spent with him, or about 17 hours you spent with him, 12 of them were tested, correct?
11 or 12.
And then you then prepared the report, which is dated March 25th, 2017. Am I correct about that?
Yes, sir.
Now, I want to talk to you about this, we call it the Wechsler test. Is that how you say that?
Yes, sir. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WACE, for short.
Okay, and it has a nickname?
WACE. Yes.
WACE, okay. And is that now like a 4th edition?
It is the WACE 4.
Is this kind of just a basic IQ test? A common IQ test?
Basic could be defined better, but it is the most commonly used IQ test.
Okay.
Yes.
And in this particular test, you are looking at a number of things. Verbal comprehension, correct?
Yes.
Perceptual reasoning,
Yes.
working memory,
Yes.
processing score,
Processing speed, yes.
processing speed, and then full scale.
Yes, there's actually about 10 different tests in this large group of tests, and they cluster together into those different categories.
And with regard to verbal comprehension, you gave him an 87. By him, I mean Mr. Godejohn.
Well, I didn't give him an 87.
He
He attained an 87.
You're scoring him up with 87.
Excuse me, please, don't speak at the same time.
You're scoring him up with 87, is that correct?
For the verbal comprehension index, yes.
And that would be the 19th percentile,
Yes, that sounds all right, low average range.
low average. And that was a lower score than even Dr. Franks gave him for that, is that correct?
Yes, he achieved a verbal comprehension index of 100 with Dr. Franks, right in the center of the average range.
Then on perceptual reasoning, you gave him an 81, or you scored him an 81.
Yes, he achieved an 81.
Again, that's the 10th percentile.
Yes, just a little bit lower than the first standard deviation below them.
Again, that's a low average classification.
Yes,
And that also is a lower score than Dr. Franks gave him, is that correct?
yes, Dr. Franks achieved a 90 on that index.
And working memory, you gave him an 83, or you scored him an 83.
Yes,
That's the 13th percentile.
correct.
That also is low average.
Yes, low average to below average slightly, yes.
And again, lower than Dr. Franks gave him, correct?
Working memory,
Yes.
I believe Dr. Franks achieved a working memory index of 77,
Okay, maybe I wrote that down wrong. Okay.
and I achieved He achieved an 83 with me, so I think that's a little higher.
All right, I apologize if I had that written down wrong. On processing score, speed, you scored a 74, correct?
Yes.
And that's the 4th percentile?
Did you say 40th or 4th? Sorry.
4th percentile. Is that the 4th
I
percentile?
believe that's about it. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think that's about right.
And you describe that as borderline.
Yes.
What do you mean by borderline?
Well, as I tried to explain with the graph earlier, there's this range that is below the average range. You can have the low average, right? And low average / below average kind of range. And then there is this zone in between that and what would classically be considered extremely low or consistent with what we would think of as intellectual disability typically. And that range is classified as the borderline range. That's the name for it.
Borderline meaning not intellectual disability, but close to it.
Yeah, not intellectual disability, but not low average, in between.
So it's even below low average.
Yes, sir.
And your pulse, I believe you obtained the same score as Dr. Franks on that, is that correct?
On the, yes, processing speed index?
Yes.
Yes.
And then your full scale IQ, you scored a 77 for Mr. Godijan, correct?
Yes, he obtained a 77 on the full scale IQ.
And that's the 6th percentile,
Yes.
and that's also borderline.
Yes, sir.
And once again, that's a lower score than Dr. Franks.
Yes, surprisingly lower and statistically significantly lower, as I mentioned.
And yesterday you told us, you said, the data is what the data is.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there's some flexibility around these numbers.
There's some error around them, yes.
And there's some flexibility around these categories as well, correct?
Well, to the extent that they're labeled certain ranges, they're generally not, with the one exception of low average to below average. It depends on who you ask what that's called. So it's very confusing, I'm sorry, because there's different classification schemes in the field right now, and we're actually trying to cohese that into one uniform standard across the board, but it's not there yet.
And yesterday with State's Exhibit 184, which was the bell curve graph, you indicated that 68% of the population has an IQ between 85 and 115. Is that correct?
68% of the general population, yes.
And the mean or the middle would be 100.
Correct.
Half the population, in theory, would have a lower IQ than 100, and half would have a higher IQ than 100.
That is true, they do.
And among those 68% of the population, they would not all be clustered closer to 85 or closer to 115. They would be spread out along that entire range. Am I correct?
Well, they are spread out, but remember the curve is like this. So they're spread out from 85 to 115, but they cluster towards the center. So most fall in the center area, but it gradually, the numbers get less and less and less as it moves out. That's the nature of the curve.
So most fall closer to 100 than 85, correct? Is that what you're telling us?
Well, yeah, it's the percentile ranking. For example, 100, the percentile ranking is 50. Okay, 50%, whereas less people fall at 16th percentile, only 16%. That's the bottom of that average.
So if 100 is average and you gave Mr. Godijan a 77, that would be, if my math is right, 23% lower than the average.
Well, it's not 23% lower. I'm sorry, that's a mischaracterization. It's the percentile-wise, there'd be a 23% change in the percentile, but it's not like percentages 5%, 10%, 15%, 100%. But a 77, if it's a valid IQ score, falls in the borderline range.
And that's a significant deviation from 100.
Yes, sir.
Now, you administered an adult Asperger's assessment,
Yes.
and that is, I guess, to determine the level of autism, or if there is autism present.
Yes, it helps inform us into the amount of autistic traits that are present in a person that's taking the examination. It includes not only questionnaires for the person himself, but also an assessment, a rating by someone who knows the person well, a family member.
Now, tell us what an autism spectrum quotient is.
Well, that's one part of the adult autism assessment. That's the autism quotient, and it's the questionnaire that the subject takes himself, and it identifies the amount of autistic-like thinking that the person has. It's commonly used in research as well as clinical practice.
What would be an average score on that, do you think, for all people who take that test with autism?
With autism? An average score with autism. Usually, individuals classified with autism, now, with Asperger's included as part of autism.
Yes.
Because usually it's designed for Asperger's, which is just a mild classification of autism. Usually the score is above 32 on that test to classify as significant enough autistic traits to be consistent with the diagnosis.
And is the Asperger's more or less severe the higher the number gets?
The higher the number, the more autistic traits the person displays in their thinking.
And he received a 28, in your view, based upon that?
Yeah, when I totaled his scores, it was a 28 when I evaluated him, yes.
And you indicated that 80% of the people with autism spectrum score 32 or more.
Yes, that's right.
What is an empathy quotient?
The empathy quotient is another questionnaire that goes into the adult Asperger's assessment. And this is a questionnaire the subject takes himself, and it measures the amount of empathy type characteristics or empathy traits that are in a person's thinking. Usually that's low for somebody with autistic traits.
And then, of course, you administered a relatives questionnaire, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what relative did you talk to?
I spoke with Mr. Godejohn's father.
Which is the same person that Dr. Frank spoke with, correct?
That's right.
Now, what is an adaptive behavior assessment system test? Tell us what that is.
The adaptive behavior assessment test is a questionnaire that can be given to the individual himself, or more commonly given to family members or teachers or people who know the person's functioning in various settings. And it's designed to measure their general adaptive function skills in home life, vocational life, academic settings, wherever, but the ability to adapt and function in that setting.
And one composite of that is called the general adaptive composite, correct?
Yes, it's a total summary score for the measure.
Dr. Denney, Mr. Godejohn scored a 72 on that, is that correct?
I'm trying to find it. I know it was relatively low. I'd like to look and just verify that that's correct. If I can find that form. There it is. I have 72. Is that what you said?
Yes, I believe
Yes,
so.
72.
And that's third percentile.
That's correct.
Can you describe that as low?
It is low, yes. It's in the low borderline range.
On conceptual, you got a 70.
Yes,
That's the second percentile.
correct.
And that's also described by you as low.
It is, yes.
On the social, you scored a 70 for Mr. Godejohn, correct?
Yes, he obtained an 80.
And that's in the 10th percentile.
10%.
And you describe that as below average.
Yes, below average, low average. Again, those classifications depend on
On
the test.
practical, you gave him a 71,
Yes,
third percentile,
correct.
and you also describe that as low.
It is low, yes.
Now, these percentiles, the lower the number, the lower the score, correct?
Yes,
So when you say the second percentile, that would mean 98% of the population would, in theory, be above that, am I correct?
that's correct.
Mr. Godejohn, in your view, has a long history with autism spectrum disorder, correct?
Yes,
His school records back that up.
yes, they do.
His social security records back that up.
Yes, they do.
And Dr. Frank backs that up, correct?
Yes,
And you concluded that he has autism spectrum disorder level 1.
correct.
requiring support, correct?
Yes, all Asperger's spectrum disorders require some level of support.
Without accompanying intellectual impairment.
Correct.
And can you just ask my next question, or answer my next question? All levels of autism require some support.
Exactly. That's the nature of the diagnosis. If they didn't require at least some level of support, it doesn't warrant a diagnosis.
And the level of support that they receive might be indicative of their ability to be successful.
Oh, it absolutely is. If the more support they need, the more severe the condition is, which the more difficulties they're going to have in life.
And in your examining all these records, did you determine whether or not Mr. Godejohn had a particularly strong support system?
As far as his family,
And whatever, any kind of support. But let's start with the family. Did you find any real support system there?
well, I mean, it was a support system. He wasn't living on his own. He had family that were involved in his life. At different periods of time when he was younger, it was less strong than it was when he was an adult. But yeah, he had some support there.
But not a significant amount.
I don't know how to answer what's a significant amount. He was in a family. He was getting his needs met. Whether he, not to say he was in an affluent family or a family with a lot of resources. No, but he was in a family.
You also diagnosed that he had a specific learning disorder
Yes,
with impairment in reading,
reading, yes, and math.
and a specific learning disorder with impairment in math. Now, neurocognitive deficits are a common finding with Asperger's syndrome, correct?
Yes,
And even with overall intellectual functioning, with these neurocognitive deficits, it still can be within an average range. Is that correct?
I don't understand your question.
Okay,
Sorry.
let me rephrase that. You indicated that in your testing, Mr. Godejohn had weak attention and impaired mental processing. Is that correct?
Mental processing speed.
Speed, yes. I apologize for not saying that. You also found he had bilateral psychomotor impairment.
Yes, motor speed.
And you felt like this contributed to his poor mental processing speeds, correct?
Yes, because the mental processing speed tasks that we have them do are motor related. So then when I used just a strictly motor speed task that didn't require really thinking, his motor speed was very slow, which tells me that that contributed to his slower mental processing speed. Not to say that he doesn't have slower mental processing speed, he likely does, but the slow motor also contributes to that.
And you felt like his cognitive profile was consistent with Asperger's syndrome.
Yes, it is.
And that is now just classified as autism spectrum disorder, correct?
Yes, Asperger's syndrome is now rolled into autism spectrum disorders, but it's the mildest form of it.
And there's no doubt in your mind that he is on the autism spectrum disorder scale, is that correct?
Yes, I believe he has enough autism characteristics that he meets the definition for autism spectrum disorder, mild.
Is autism considered a disability?
Yes, it is.
Is it considered a severe disability?
It can be. Again, autism can be so extreme that children and people are completely non-functional. But then it can also be very mild, where there are people with autism spectrum disorder that are actually very successful in their vocations, and some even famous. But generally speaking, they have some level of disability that they need a level of support, hence the diagnosis.
Is autism considered a neuropsychological disorder?
Yes, I believe that would be a fair.
Is executive function impaired in autism?
Oftentimes, but not necessarily always.
And executive function is planning and reasoning?
Executive function is a little broader, and it's like you'd think an executive. Well, the executive doesn't do the actual nuts and bolts of the business or whatever, but they're making sure that all those departments are functioning at their optimal. So they organize everything else, and that's the way it is in the brain. Executive functioning organizes and integrates the other cognitive functions. So it includes abstract reasoning, judgment, problem solving, mental flexibility, and then these can all be divided into language-based and non-language-based type of skills. Also impulse control.
Does Mr. Godejohn have a neurological disability?
Yes, I would say that autism spectrum disorder is a neurologically based disability.
Even with level 1, which is what you've diagnosed Mr. Godejohn with, without substantial supports in place, deficits in social communication cause noticeable impairments. That is according to the State's Exhibit 185 that we showed you yesterday. Is that correct?
That's the DSM.
No, the State's Exhibit 185, the table with the severity levels for autism that prosecutor reviewed.
Yes, that came out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but I'd have to see it to verify the way you read is the correct
I'll be
level.
glad to show you my copy of the State's Exhibit 185. If you don't mind, Judge, can I approach the witness?
Of course. You might point to them where you were reading from, or repeated, Mr. Perry.
My question was, even with level 1, without substantial supports in place, deficits in social communication can't cause noticeable impairments.
Okay, that's incorrect. You added an extra word. It's
I
already.
didn't mean to add the word can. Let me rephrase.
No, that's not the word you added.
What did I add?
You added substantial. It doesn't say substantial. It says without supports in place.
Okay.
Deficits in
That's
social
wrote down. I apologize.
communication.
Let me rephrase it then to be right. Without supports in place, deficits in social communication cause noticeable impairments.
That's
Is that correct?
Yes.
And even with level 1, a person who is able to speak in full sentences and engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fails, and whose attempts to make friends are odd and typically unsuccessful. Did I read that correctly?
I believe so. It was fast, but yes.
All right. Mr. Godejohn didn't pay the bills, did he? According to the information you had.
He told me that he did pay his cell phone bill.
Did he ever have a bank account?
He told me that he did have a bank account. He had one that was in his name, but then there was also another bank account that was in his mother's name. That's what he told me. I didn't verify that.
Did he ever live independently?
No.
Did he need reminders to shower and groom?
I believe that was not uncommon for him to need to be reminded to clean up a little bit.
Just one moment.
Yes, sir.
Judge, that's all the questions I had as witness.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Ask anything further? Just a few questions, Your Honor. Yes, sir.
Dr. Denney, within the autism spectrum disorder, you only have these 3 categories of severity, 3 levels of severity, correct?
Based on the DSM diagnostic manual, that's correct.
And so with only those 3 available, you place the defendant in level 1, correct?
That's correct.
The highest functioning level.
It is the highest functioning level.
Within the folks that would be within level 1, how would you describe them?
If we were to take just that group, I would say that the information I have and his interaction with me and the records suggest that he's at the higher functioning edge of that. And some of his scores regarding autism are actually higher than or better than what would be in this categorization. So he's really just barely in the diagnosis, in my opinion.
Mr. Perry mentioned the executive function testing that you did with the defendant. How did the defendant score in those executive function tests?
If I may look,
Yes.
I don't want to speak incorrectly. His overall executive function summary score, which is, again, a summary of all of the little tests that go in that area, was a standard score of 97. Okay, on the same scale we talked about earlier, which is a percentile ranking of 42. It's in the average range. Now, that module of the battery includes different tests. One, it was mazes, being able to work your way through mazes with a pen and pencil, which he scored in the average range. The other one was judgment, which we talked about yesterday, which he scored in the above average range. And that's a verbal judgment, problem solving. I read some of that to you. Categories, which would be verbal and to some extent nonverbal concept formation, to be able to pull concepts out of the information you see. It's very abstract. His score was in the average range on that. Then on word generation, this is where you have to come up with as many words as you can think of that begin with a certain letter, or in this instance with this test, you have to put together as many words you can think of using a list of letters that are given to you. Okay, so it's a speed and middle processing task that is focused on generating language, generating words. And he performed in the moderately impaired range on that, at the first percentile. So that was a significant deficit for him in the language area. But then in his perseveration, the tendency to inappropriately do the same thing again and again and again, to not stop yourself from doing that, he had no problem with that whatsoever. It fell in the average range.
Overall, how would you describe the defendant's executive functions with regard to abstract reasoning, problem solving, and judgment?
Regarding abstract reasoning, problem solving, and judgment, they're perfectly normal, if not above average in some cases.
Nothing further.
Just a couple. You indicated that, I think you said, if I got it right, that he's barely in autism. Is that what I understood you to say?
Based upon my evaluation with him and my interactions with him and the scores, I believe he falls within the classification of autism spectrum disorder, but he's at the highest level of that condition. But he's in it.
And when was he first diagnosed with autism?
He was diagnosed initially with autism when he was very young. When he had a decrease of language function and a lower IQ as well, or at least cognitive functioning in general. And he was diagnosed with just the other diagnosis of autism. Not Asperger's, but autism. But then as he matured, he caught up in the language areas and the overall cognitive areas to such a degree that the diagnosis changed to Asperger's syndrome. The only reason it's autism now, again, is because in 2013, the diagnostic manual changed and rolled Asperger's syndrome back into a general classification of autism spectrum.
Was there ever a time when he was not diagnosed with autism after the first diagnosis?
No.
Now, in your report, you say about this situation, neurocognitive deficits are a common finding with Asperger's syndrome, even when overall intellectual function is within the average range.
Yes, sir.
Is that true?
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Judge.
Thank you. Dr. Denney, be excused?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Doctor?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Folks, we have some students in the courtroom today. I want to remind you that the rules apply to everyone, that you won't be able to use your cell phones while you're in the courtroom, okay? All right. So, Mr. Anderson, do you have any additional rebuttal evidence?
Your Honor, that concludes the rebuttal evidence.
All right. Mr. Perry, do you have any further rebuttal?
We do not, Judge.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the point in the trial where all of the evidence has been presented. Both parties have rested. I have to work with the state and with the defense in crafting some jury instructions for you. If I could see the parties over here. Folks, what we're going to do is give you an early recess and come back at 12:30. I'm sorry you had to come in here for a half hour and then be sent away for 3 hours, but at least the weather's nice. So I want to again remind you of what you were told at the first recess of the court. Until you retire to consider your verdict, you must not discuss this case among yourselves or with others, or permit anyone to discuss it in your hearing. You should not form or express any opinion about the case until it is finally given to you to decide. Do not do any research or investigation on your own about any matter regarding this case or anyone involved with the trial. Do not communicate with others about the case by any means. Do not read, view, or listen to any newspaper, radio, electronic communication from the internet, or television report of the trial. And to sort of give you an idea of how the day will proceed, beginning at 12:30. You'll come up and I'll read to you a series of jury instructions. That will be the law that you will follow in the case. And then the parties have the opportunity to make their closing statements to you. And then you will be left to deliberate. And we'll do that back in the jury deliberation room. Okay? I don't go late on deliberation, but I'll leave it really to you. I'm not going to suggest how long you should or shouldn't deliberate. I'll leave it up to you to decide how late in the day you wish to go with that. Okay? So we'll see you back at 12:30 downstairs. Okay? All right. All righty. We can recess until 12:15, at which time we'll have the formal jury conference. If I can meet with the parties, attorneys, privately, we'll go through this informally. So Mr. Godeshaw will give you some lunch, and we'll have you back here about 12:15. Okay? Thank you. All right.
May it please the court.
Yes, sir.
Although this is the state versus Nicholas Godeshaw, we knew that. There's been another obvious presence here throughout this trial. And it started Thursday when you came in for jury selection, right? This other presence that we knew had kind of this overarching narrative, and that's Gypsy. Gypsy Blanchard is absolutely a part of this case. And she does have this narrative that many of you may have anticipated would be really a part of the trial, and it is. And she does have a story about her childhood and about how her relationship with her mom and how her mom abused her. But if we're not careful, there can be a tendency to let Gypsy's narrative overshadow what we're really here to decide. Because all along, flying under the radar, coolly, deliberately, was the defendant, Nicholas Godeshaw. And while you're considering the evidence, Gypsy is absolutely a part of the facts. But when it comes to your legal determination of the defendant's guilt, which you were given in instruction number 6, she's not. And because she has such a presence, because she had such a story, when you look at how simple murder in the first degree is, it appears as though something's missing. It feels like there should be more, and there could be, again, that tendency to want to take some of the drama, some of the other things that have made this case interesting back with you when you're deciding the defendant's guilt. But it doesn't go. If you look up at the instructions, there is nothing there that references whether or not Gypsy helped plan or whether or not Gypsy asked the defendant to kill. It's not there. Not because we forgot it. It's not missing. It's because when it comes to the defendant's guilt, it doesn't matter. There may be a tendency to consider the victim, Claudine, and how she was, and the things she did, and how she abused Gypsy. But then again, look at instruction number 6. Is there anything there that references her character? We didn't forget it. It's not missing. It's that when it comes to the defendant's guilt, it doesn't matter. All that matters is what the defendant did on June 10th of 2015. And absolutely, you heard as part of the facts that Gypsy did have a role. She was the one to ask the defendant to kill her mom. But we have to be careful and separate out what is collaboration versus manipulation. Because there could be this sense that because Gypsy was the one that asked the defendant, somehow she manipulated the defendant into killing her mom. Let's think about that for a minute. Think about manipulation. It requires some kind of deception. I want to steal a car. So I tell you, hey, see that car over there? The owner said I could have it. It's okay. Could you just go get it for me? That's manipulation, because we're deceiving. Versus, hey, that car over there, I want to steal it. Do you want to do it for me? That's not manipulation. She asked him, but he said yes. And if you think about it, in a way, Gypsy asked in the least manipulative way because she didn't lie at all. She put it all out there. She didn't try to do it through innuendo. She didn't make up things. She just said, this is what's happening to me. Will you kill my mom? There's no manipulation there because ultimately it was the defendant's decision. Nothing was held back from him. And if anything was evident from the dynamic of their relationship that you saw in the Facebook, in the text messages, in the interview, and in Gypsy's testimony, Nicholas Beaudejean was not made to ever do anything Nicholas Beaudejean did not want to do. And what you saw from the beginning of that request was actually the defendant not only agreeing to this murder, but really getting into this murder. Remember, he's the one that told her, talking himself up, that he's this assassin. And you saw through the text messages how he talks about how don't underestimate his need for killing, how he's getting excited. That's not manipulation. Yes, he was asked to do it, but from that, he took it from there. And he got into it. And he enjoyed it. Now, the issue that you do have to decide, now that we see that no, there's nothing missing, although this is a big, dramatic story, that this case that you are here to decide is quite narrow. We know he killed her. That's not disputed. We know he was trying to kill her. But the real issue is deliberation, right? And whether or not the defendant had the capacity to do so. At this point, there really shouldn't even be any question that the defendant deliberated, because he did. There are psychological things we can look at, and those are important to consider. But at the end of the day, if you're wondering if somebody has the ability to do X, the best evidence is, did they do X? And in this case, that's what happened. Do we wonder, does the defendant have the ability to deliberate? We can think of the psychology, but then put that in context with, what did he do? He did it all the way along for a whole year. Not only that, he described it. And he actually described it quite vividly in that last interview you saw when he's describing sort of his final deliberation, the culmination of the year. And he describes literally what deliberation is using symbols, the angel and the devil. And he talks about considering both. And that at the end, it was his decision, the bitch is dead. His words. Now, no amount of mild autism, level 1, Asperger's changes the fact that you heard him describe it in his own words, that he chose the bitch is dead. And So when looking at your decision, which is to decide his capacity to deliberate the moment he murders Claudine, start from that moment and let's think, how did we get there? And you saw a lot of different evidence leading up, but it goes back over a year. You remember this Facebook message with his friend from May 16th. That is over a year, or right at a year, before the defendant murdered Claudine. And as you see here, his response when he talks about how Gypsy changed her mind about killing her mom. Yes, she said she wants to see how our original plan goes first, with me meeting her and her mom and such. I guess she wanted to only do it as a last resort. Taking that apart, in that moment, May 16, 2014, the defendant knows that killing Claudine is a plan, that it's in the works. He also knows he's the one doing it, because that was clear from the very beginning. He was going to be the one to physically do it. And he is demonstrating right here reflection, because he's recognizing, one, that murdering is the worst option. It's the heaviest option. It has the most risk. It's the most final. So he even recognizes that that is a last resort. But also, he recognizes that they have the alternative plans. He's reflecting on what the ultimate goal is, to be with Gypsy. And not only does he mention the alternatives, he did them. So when you want to talk about capacity, he did that. You heard both in his interview and in Gypsy's, they tried it in March of 2015. That was going to be the first plan. Try to get mom to like him. Well, not surprisingly, mom seeing a 26-year-old guy at a Disney movie by himself, that didn't go over great. So plan one didn't work. But it was still an alternative he considered. Then you also remember some of the Skype messages from March, where the other plan was to get her pregnant. Again, considering another alternative to the last resort. Then we move forward. Once we get to May of 2015, now we're about a month before the murder. Here's what we know. We know that of all the planning Gypsy did, the defendant was given how. And it was his choice to stab. It was his choice to use a knife. We know that. We also know that he wanted tape. He wanted bondage tape. You saw that in the text messages, but more importantly, you heard Gypsy testify to that yesterday, that that was his idea. And that he wanted to do it to muffle Claudine. So again, going back to capacity to deliberate, he clearly recognizes that if you stab someone to death, that's going to cause noise. Causing noise means you could get caught. Using tape to muffle helps prevent you getting caught. No amount of Asperger's, autism, whether you're on the high side of the IQ or the low side, doesn't make that concept any better. He thought of it and he considered it, and clearly he was doing it. Then when we get to the 19th, where we see he's considering his tool, the tool that he has chosen to do this. And again, he knows he wants to stab her, and he's thinking, he's reflecting, because you see he's even looking at different categories. Tactical knives, SEAL team knife, jungle primitive knife, cold steel trailmaster knife. He's looking at different knives, considering which one of these is going to work best. He's reflecting upon that. And you actually heard, although there was a big deal made of it in opening, the fact that it was Gypsy that gave the defendant the knife. It was his idea to use it, and he told her to get it. And if you recall, he actually told her first to get a machete. Now, we can only somewhat speculate what he planned to do with the machete, but it's probably safe to say it wasn't going to be any better for Claudine than what he did with that smaller knife. But that was his choice that he's doing on May 19th as he thinks about what he's going to do. Then we get to the 28th. You remember the other thing from the text messages and the testimony of Gypsy is that it was the defendant's idea to use a taser. He wanted to use a taser. And she actually testified that at one point she apologized to him for not getting it. And remember what she said, why he wanted it? To keep her from fighting. So let's go back to his ability, his capacity. He knows he wants to murder Claudine. He knows a victim that's not fighting back is easier to kill, so he wants to use a taser. He could have a genius IQ, and there's not going to be any better deliberation on that than what you see. He considered a way to make the murder easier for himself. On May 28th, he also, as you heard, had the capacity to realize they may get caught. And if we get caught, we should probably have a story. And you saw both from the testimony of Gypsy, but even here in these text messages, you see they're starting on the right. Dear, please go with the story. I told my mom and stepdad. And then you see Gypsy responding, please let me know what story. And then the defendant, I'll tell you in person, dear, because I'll be able to explain it better then. That was his story, his deliberation on what would happen if they got caught. And you heard it in his interview. That was the first story he told when he said, I came up here because Gypsy got kicked out of her house, so I just came on the Greyhound and brought her back. That's their story. But he came up with it because he had the capacity to think ahead of what might happen after the murder. On June 9th, as he's sitting at the day's end, he sends this text message, dear, should I ask you this before he has to? Is your mom a light or a deep sleeper? Again, that didn't come from Gypsy. That's not her words. That is the defendant having the capacity to think, if I'm going to a victim who's sleeping, a light sleeper may awake, may create more of a fight versus a deep sleeper. He's thinking about it. He's considering it well beforehand. And then after he's told that she's a light sleeper, again, he's in his role that he has taken on willingly and saying that he's excited. Then you have a little bit later, he asks Gypsy, does her floor squeak? He has the capacity to know that when you are creeping up on a sleeping victim, especially a light sleeper that he just found out, something like the floor squeaking could wake her up. That's going to make the murder more difficult. That's all him, all the defendant. You heard about his outfit. You see here where Gypsy asks, what will you be wearing, hon? His words, his part of the plan, his choice. He says something that will terrify her. It's all black. My evil side picked the full outfit. So we have the capacity to know, one, that something scary would be a clown t-shirt with evil clowns on it. He was thinking ahead that when I'm sitting on top of her, straddling her, all black, with my black shirt and my black hoodie, what's something that's going to freak her out? How about some scary looking clowns? And he was pretty spot on. As we're getting even closer now, it's June 10th, about 1:11 a.m. He is now making sure he has the right address. He has the capacity to know if he does not go to the right address, that's going to delay, and that could cause problems in the plan. He's given the address, and then just to make sure, upon reflection, he looks it up on Google Maps. He sees how much it's going to cost for the taxi. The gloves. Another thing that was brought up by the defense in opening was that, well, it was Gypsy that handed him the gloves. Well, it was the defendant's decision to put them on. And actually, as you remember from the text messages, even Gypsy texted him there on the right, you may not need to put on the gloves because we will sink it. And she told you she meant sinking the knife. And the defendant, not Gypsy, it was the defendant's decision, no, he's still going to put the gloves on. And you remember his interview, both of his interviews, the one with Maholey, Detective Maholey, and the one from jail with the reporter. He was proud of the fact that you wouldn't find fingerprints. He said that multiple times. And he said, you won't find fingerprints because I was wearing gloves. He had the capacity to know wearing gloves is going to lessen the chance of fingerprints. And then we have probably the most cryptic, which is he's there at the door. And this is the plan. She's going to come get him, and then Gypsy's going to go to the bathroom, and he's going to go do what he's going to do. And typically, in a situation like that, when you picture the defendant standing there, knowing what he's about to do, right, we may have to sort of use inference to determine his deliberation. But we don't, because that's the moment that the defendant talked about where he thought, angel, devil, the bitch is dead. It's at this moment. Then he says that even as he stands outside the bedroom, he waits another minute. So another way, I know you've heard me say deliberate, and you're probably getting tired of it, so I'll pick a new word. The opposite of deliberate would be impulse, right? Impulsive. There is not one part of this murder, of this plan going back a year, that is impulsive. And even in the final moment, where you would think under emotion, under passion, someone would finally make an impulsive decision, standing outside the bedroom door of the person you're about to go stab, even then, the defendant can't act impulsively. Even then, he deliberates before doing it. That's what this case is. And all of the things we've just looked at, all the texts, all the web history, can you tell from any of that he has high-functioning autism? He's not doing anything different than someone else who's planning a murder, taking steps to incapacitate the victim, taking steps in case you're caught to have a story. His mild autism changes nothing about any of the deliberation that you just saw. And even his description of the murder and how he actually stabbed, he even did that deliberately. Initially, you think 17 stab wounds, that must be some kind of frenzy, especially considering how deep the cut to the neck is. But he even talked about that was purposeful. He did that purposely, so she would bleed more. He cut the back of her neck so she would bleed more and die quickly. Even that part was deliberate. So when you look at it all, there really is no way to see this as anything other than cool reflection. And the fact that he does have mild autism, it doesn't change anything. And when you go back to where we started, these simple 3 elements, it doesn't change. And even the things you heard about Claudine, how she mistreated Gypsy, I anticipate you'll hear that he had this moment, like you heard in opening, where he sees the wheelchair, sees she can walk. That's no moment of passion. He knew a long time before that she could walk. So was Gypsy mistreated? Absolutely. Is the defendant some knight that's coming in to save her? Let's be real. You heard his interview. How many times did you hear the defendant mention, oh, I was rescuing her, I was saving her, I was freeing her? I can tell you, 0. In the text messages leading up, how many times did you see him make any reference to, I'm coming to get you, just hang in there, right? You're going to be free soon. I can do this. How many times did you see it? 0. Instead, you see, I expect you to be wearing something specific, red lipstick when I get there, and when I come get you from the bathroom after I murder your mom, you better be naked. The defendant had his very clear own reasons for doing this. So to make this seem like he came in here to save her is completely contrary to everything else you saw.
5 minutes.
Thank you. There's no question that Claudine mistreated Gypsy and that she deserved to be held accountable for that. Absolutely. But she deserved to be held accountable in here, with 12 people like you judging fairly, impartially. That's how she should have been held accountable. All the same rights that the defendant had. All the rights that he has sits there when he stabbed somebody 17 times. The defendant didn't get to hold court himself in the bedroom at 2 a.m, straddling her as she's sleeping, literally stabbing her in the back. He didn't get to hold court that way or hold her accountable that way. That's not how we do it. As I said in the beginning, no doubt, Gypsy was a part of this murder. She bought him the tickets for the Greyhound bus. But without Nicholas Godejean, nobody's getting on that bus. Her money helped pay for the Days Inn hotel room. Without Nicholas Godejean, nobody is sitting in that hotel room texting, getting excited, and preparing for murder. She came to the door. Without Nicholas Godejean, nobody's walking through that door. She handed him gloves. Without Nicholas Godejean, nobody's wearing those gloves. And she handed him a knife. But without Nicholas Godejean, nobody is holding that knife and stabbing Claudine to death. Just as you can't imagine this crime without Gypsy, it's not happening without Nicholas Godejean, which is why after you consider the evidence, there's just no other decision than he is guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action.
Nicholas Godejean is not guilty of first-degree murder simply because he didn't have the ability to deliberate. And it's not as simple as the prosecutor just told you. It's a very complex process. And I'm going to talk about all the things I want you to consider in deciding whether he did in fact deliberate. And I believe when you hear all of what we all have to say, and you think about all of the evidence, you will come to that conclusion. He did not deliberate. Now, let's get one thing straight. Who wanted Claudine Blanchard dead? Who? Gypsy did. Gypsy wanted Claudine Blanchard dead. And but for that simple fact,
We're not here, are we? Gypsy's focus during this entire process was getting out of that home. That's all she ever thought about. What was Nicholas's focus during that entire time? Gypsy. Do you remember the interview with law enforcement when they started asking him questions about this murder? What did he talk about? Gypsy. He talked about Gypsy. This whole thing comes back to Gypsy's determination to do whatever it took, plan A, plan B, plan C, to do whatever it took to get out of that home. And we can understand that. We can absolutely understand that. She wanted out of that home so bad that she would kill her mother. And let's also not forget why she didn't kill her mother. By that I mean personally. Why didn't she kill her mother? Because she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. You saw her. She's tiny. She's tiny. Plus, I mean, probably she just emotionally couldn't do it. But she wouldn't stop until it was done. And she was going to find somebody to do it, whatever it took. I want you to think about the ways that she set about doing this. The most important way is she did, in fact, manipulate him. She did, in fact, manipulate him. And we can call it anything we want. That's what she did. She manipulated him into doing this. And again, why did she kill her? Because in her mind, she had no choice. She wanted to have a normal life. She wanted to be a normal person. But her mother wouldn't allow it. Let's also not forget, with regard to the three plans, A, B, and C, she actually tried one of them. And I can't remember which one was which, but I think it may have been plan A. And if you remember what that was, she wanted to run away. And she did. And what happened? Her mother brought her back. And then what happened? Things got worse. She was chained to a bed. She was deprived food. She was beaten. That's how that worked. Remember the other plan? For her to get pregnant. Why? Because if she got pregnant, well then after all, they could get married or they'd have to be together. She'd already tried running away. She'd tried everything. And so then she reaches a point where she feels like she's stuck and she's got to do something. She'd had enough. She did manipulate him, and she herself is fully capable of deception. It was her life. She is fully capable of deception because that's how she lived her life. She was trained that way by her own mother. She was trained to pretend to be sick, although much of that time she probably didn't realize that she wasn't sick. She was trained to pretend to be a child, and she got tired of that. She manipulated this situation in so many ways. There are two people in this case that in so many ways are very childlike. Nicholas Godejohn and Gypsy, for very different reasons. Gypsy because of the way her mother forced her to live her life. And Nicholas because of the life he had. And if you just think about some of the facts in this case, you think about what you've heard, and think about the childlike nature of some of this stuff. What did they do with the murder weapon? They put it in an envelope and mailed it to his house. With what? Her return address. Does that seem like a person that has a lot of capacity? They hung around for Springfield 2 days after this happened. For 2 days. That doesn't seem to make much sense. They went to his parents' home. They thought they were going to get married and move on with their life as if nothing happened. I think Gypsy said, hey, I thought they'd forget about me and I could just go on living my life. They didn't realize these online conversations that went on forever about all kinds of stuff, much of it fantasy. They didn't realize that was being recorded, or they'd figure out where they went. They checked into these rooms. They used what names? Their names. They took cabs. He took a cab from his hotel right to this house. And then after the murder, what did they do? They took a cab from this house away from it. That is a childlike decision, if you think about it. A real killer would have been a whole lot more smart. At least a real killer that had the capacity to deliberate would have been a lot smarter than that. Even the texts themselves were rather juvenile. And you saw the text. Much of it was fantasy. All kinds of stuff. All kinds of fantasy. And these two, they got stuck in this fantasy, and it's hard for them to know where fantasy ends and reality starts. Even the prosecutor showed you one of the texts about, I believe it was the tape. If you look real close, you notice that's a sex toy website. That's a sex toy website. This case has to be one of the most unique cases you'll ever see in a homicide. There is a unique set of facts in this case that just doesn't seem to come around very often. Think about the unique set of facts. In some ways, everybody involved in this case is a victim, sort of. And I use that word very cautiously because I don't want to, say something outrageous. Dee Dee was certainly victimized Gypsy in horrible ways. Horrible ways. Gypsy manipulated Nick, a low-functioning person with autism. And then Gypsy pressures Nick into committing a homicide against her mother. And that's the way that it's sort of a triangle, and they all sort of victimize each other in some ways. It's also unique in that you have this 23-year-old woman who has to pretend to be 16. And she acted the part well. She learned to manipulate. She was forced to live in a wheelchair by her mother. And she acted the part well. And again, she was so desperate that she felt like the only option for her to have a life was to kill. Her mother lived off charity. That's why Gypsy was in a wheelchair. Gypsy learned that. Gypsy learned to steal just like her mother. She was stealing from her mother, among other places. That's all she knew. That's what she was taught. Her mother used manipulation to take advantage of people. So certainly so would she. And then when you're taking somebody in the situation that Nicholas Godejohn is in, with the cognitive deficits that he has, it's not real hard to manipulate him, is it? It's not real hard. The prosecutor talked about some of the things that, but for Nick, wouldn't have happened. You'll also notice, but for Gypsy, they wouldn't have happened either. Not anything would have happened in this case, but for Gypsy. She was tired of not being able to grow up. She wanted a real life. And with Nick, she felt like she had one. And she felt like he was her rescuer. And she felt like he could do what she needed done. And she manipulated Nick. She planned virtually the entire thing. She obtained the gloves. She obtained the knife. She paid for everything. He didn't have any money. He couldn't have paid for anything. She paid for everything. I guess she's technically stole the knife, but she told him when, and she made the decision to move it up. She decided, we need to do this quicker because you're about out of money. That was her decision. It was her decision to kill her mother. She talked him into it. He didn't talk her into doing it. She talked him into doing it. Let's talk about Nick Godejohn for a second. We had one job. Couldn't hold it. Not because he's a bad person, because he just didn't have capacity to hold the job. It wasn't a terribly difficult job, But like all jobs, it is difficult, and it's important work. It's good work, honest work. But he couldn't hold it. Didn't have a driver's license. He comes up with this story, according to the prosecutor, of what they're going to tell the police when they get caught or if they get caught, which is interesting since they didn't think they were going to get caught. I'm not sure why they really needed this story. But if you stop and think about this story, it doesn't even make any sense. The story is, if we get caught, we're going to say I ran into you out by the motel and I took you to Wisconsin. Did you notice something about that story? What does it not account for? Her mother's death. There's no explanation as to how they're going to explain that. It doesn't account for that. This is a story they're going to tell his mother about why gypsies in Wisconsin. That's the point of this story. Nick was so completely in love with her and so obsessed with her that he would do anything. And Gypsy knew that. And Gypsy knew that. In his mind, he thought exactly like her, that there was no alternative. He was told she tried to run away. He was also told why she couldn't run away that day. Remember, her mom had papers. What does that mean? Well, not only can she go get her, but she can force her to come back legally, even though she's 23 years old. Nicholas Godejohn wanted Gypsy to be happy, and he wanted her to have the life she deserved. In his own mind, he thought of himself as her rescuer. Again, we're recognizing that doesn't make what he did right, but you have to look at it from his perspective, with his cognitive condition. He worshipped her. He'd lived an isolated life. The prosecutor likes to talk about these girlfriends he had. They were all online. Those were not girlfriends as we normally think of it. Gypsy was his girlfriend. He now had the life he wanted, just like she had the life or saw the life she wanted. His disability is clear from all this, including the tape, the interviews. You can see it. It's obvious. His disability is clear, and that would have affected his mind. There's a lot of discussion of text in this case, and you'll notice most of these texts are just meaningless conversation. And one of the things to keep in mind about any kind of text or email or anything like that is it only has real meaning if you see the whole context. And to take little portions of it and try to spin it in the worst possible way and make it as bad as possible. There's talk about a dark side and a good side. He made the same comment with the reporter. Remember that? He talked about that. He even said she talked about running away. The fact of the matter is the texts don't really tell us a lot. I'm not saying they don't tell us anything, because they do tell us some things, but they don't tell us anything about deliberation, anything about cool reflection. All they tell us about is the discussions they had. Now, all of this has to be viewed in the context of the experts, Dr. Franks and Dr. Denney. Dr. Franks gave you an honest, straightforward explanation of what he found. He found, after evaluating Nicholas Godejohn, that he suffered from, or he had autism spectrum disorder level 2, requiring support with accompanying impairment. And we know that Nick didn't have a lot of support at home. He pretty much lived on his own. Dr. Franks felt like a person in that situation might very well struggle to deliberate. That was his opinion. Dr. Denney mostly talked about Dr. Denney. He mostly talked about his CV and all the papers he wrote and all that stuff. All at $150 an hour. If you're wondering why he talked so much, there's your answer. He didn't really tell us much about Nicholas Godejohn, he mostly wanted to criticize Dr. Franks. What was his experience with persons with autism? He evaluated 4 to 5. Not a whole lot of real experience. Not a whole lot of real experience. He tried to downplay his own IQ scores for Nick, even though it was lower than Dr. Franks's. Had this chart, Bell chart, and had this extensive discussion of where the median is. Bottom line, his number was 77. Intellectual disability is 70. He also said there's numbers have a little bit of play, And despite the fact that that was in single digits in terms of percentile, I want to say it was less than 10, meaning more than 90% of the population would have a higher IQ. He tried to somehow explain that, put it in the middle. Remember his little chart? And he also told you that most of the numbers were close to 100. I believe that was his testimony, because he said the higher up you went, and that would be toward 100, the numbers kind of began to congregate. But he kind of explained it as if most people are all in this small range. People fit along that chart. And there's a reason that Nicholas Godejohn's IQ is 23 points lower than the average person. And that's significant. Even he had to admit that's borderline. He also talked about Dr. Franks' data being off, despite the number being bigger. But he never really told you how it was messed up. He figured, he fixed it. That's how he did that. And he said something that's really interesting. He said, the data is what the data is. That is 77. All evidence in this case demonstrates that Nicholas Godejohn has a low IQ. That is undisputed by anybody. The simple fact of the matter is Nicholas Godejohn did not have the ability for cool reflection. And if you look at the instruction, and you'll have a copy, you may have copies, on instruction number 6, paragraph 3, the prosecutor's shown you that. And it says that defendant did so after deliberation, which means cool reflection upon the matter for any length of time, no matter how brief. Let's take the second part, or the last part first. For any length of time, no matter how brief. It's not a function of time. It doesn't say if it's less than 5 seconds or more than 5 seconds. It's saying the time, it doesn't matter, no matter how brief. The real important part is the cool reflection. That's the important part, the cool reflection. Far more important than the other part, because if you have that, it doesn't matter for how long. But you have to have it. That we don't have in this case. When you consider all the evidence, does he really have the ability to deliberate? Does he really have the capacity to deliberate, given all the evidence in this case? When you consider his cognitive disorder, when you consider the pressure she put on him to do this, her unwillingness to consider other alternatives. He talks about his dark side. And he still talked about that when he was interviewed by, I believe, the reporter. We don't have the cool reflection in this case. I would ask every one of you to think long and hard about the facts of this case and consider all the facts and consider all the evidence and all the witnesses, including our witnesses we put on, Gypsy Blanchard and Dr. Franks. Consider all the evidence and decide what's appropriate. And have some compassion for everybody in this case. Dee Dee deserves compassion. She really does. I mean, I know she did a lot of horrible stuff. And I agree with the prosecutor. She should have been prosecuted rather than murdered. Gypsy deserves a lot of compassion, obviously, given what she went through. Have a little bit for Nick as well. I'm not asking you not to spread it out. I'm just asking you to have a little bit for Nick too. Consider his situation. It's not as simple as the prosecutor said. Consider his situation. And I'm talking about his entire situation. He was only trying to help the woman he loved. He didn't do it the right way. We all agree with that. But he was only trying to help the woman he loved. Nick is not guilty of first-degree murder because he simply lacked the ability to deliberate. Find Nick not guilty of first-degree murder, and then look at the alternatives, the other homicides that are available to you, and decide which one best fits the facts. I believe after all the evidence that you consider, there is reasonable doubt as to his capacity to deliberate for first-degree murder. And I believe the appropriate verdict in this case is one of the lesser homicides. Thank you very much for your time.
May I please support? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, if I wanted to know if I could draw a picture of a dog, you could examine my education, how I did in art class, whether I had some kind of mental disease, and try to decide whether I could do that based on all that history. Or I could draw a dog and it might not be a very good dog, but we know I can draw a dog because I did it. And that's what happened in this case. You know the defendant deliberated because you've seen the evidence. Many times you have to figure that out from a homicide case based on someone shooting someone. You don't have as much evidence. You have not just his statement, but years of evidence of him deliberating. Let's talk about Dr. Franks for a minute. Remember, he diagnosed him with autism spectrum disorder level 2 with intellectual impairment, but said that that was the same as his Asperger's from before, and it was a mild form of autism. And when I asked him, does that diagnosis prevent someone suffering from it from having a state of mind that's the element of offense? What did he tell me? No. I asked him, well, what should you look at to see if they had the state of mind? And what did he tell us? Everything that you could, all of the facts surrounding the case. Would it include statements about what the person said they were thinking before they committed the crime? Yes. And he followed up. That would be the best indication.
I knew there was no coming back. There was two thoughts that came in my mind. One was a benevolent thought, and the other one was a malevolent thought. It was almost like having a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. Basically what happened was I had one thought in my mind out of nowhere appear, and it just appeared. I didn't know. It was almost like, I guess you could call it God, is what everyone likes to call it. Him talking to you, or an angel talking to you, through him maybe. Basically saying, take her and run. That was another thought, take her and run. As if it was the kind of feeling that it was basically trying to influence on me, as if I was somehow going to get away with it, if I ran away with it. As if somehow we were able to keep her mom at bay, better than she was able to in the past when she ran away. However, the other thought came on my mind was, because it saw as basically, because the darker part of me was also in love with the darker part of her. And because of it, the thought was, excuse my French, but it basically said, this bitch is dead. Not letting her get between me and her, this bitch is dead. Basically is what the thought was. And unfortunately, I ended up listening to my darker side because I wanted to be with her.
He wanted to be with her. That's why he killed Claudine Blanchard. He wanted a sex slave. Remember their whole, Gypsy talked about it. You can see it in the text. Daddy, master, daddy's girl. You heard her talk about that relationship, how he had her do the humiliating things in a script for him. He would not be the first man who did awful and stupid things to have sex with a woman. That's why he committed this crime, was to have Gypsy Blanchard for himself. And how do you know he knew what he was doing when he was in the interview with the detective, what did he do at the very first part of that interview? He told the lie, right? Remember how they were hiding in the closet, hiding the knife in the closet, getting their stories together? He told the story they came up with. Why is he worried about Gypsy? If you commit a crime with someone and they're in the other room and you've been separated, what are you worried they're doing? Right? Giving it all up. And he's got no idea. Told the story just as they had planned. And then, you'll remember again the story about what they're going to tell their mom and dad. Of course, those stories are going to be slightly different. You have to have a story for them about why Gypsy shows up at your house, right, to live with you. Hopefully you don't get caught. You never have to tell the other story. But if you do get caught, you got to have the story for the closet to tell the police. 26 minutes into the interview, and you'll recall how Dr. Frank said they had no eye contact. If you want to, watch State's Exhibit 149 again. They had plenty of eye contact, normal hand gestures, no odd, nonverbal communication. 26 minutes in here, and that's the purpose of coming to Springfield was to kill Dee Dee, to be with Gypsy. Talk about how he stabbed her many times. You have to listen carefully for that part, because it talks about there's more holes, more bleeding. Cut her neck to kill her quickly. Dee Dee yelling for Gypsy didn't stop him going. In fact, he told her, "Stop resisting, you're dead." Thought about raping Dee Dee, but felt bad killing her, so he killed her quickly. He's even deliberating about how to commit the crime as he's committing it. Had a special knock on the door to let Gypsy know it was him. Had warned her, "Don't you come in that room. Don't come near me because I might hurt you." And then he talked about the sex with Gypsy after. You have to listen carefully for it. He says, "Obviously, I was in charge," which matches what Gypsy told you about how he initially wanted to rape Dee Dee, but instead she bargained with him to allow her to rape him. Was it a rape fantasy they were playing out? It started out that way. What would she also tell you? That during it, she told him to stop, and he didn't. Dr. Denney, who is very well educated, a smart guy, found errors with Dr. Frank's work. Dr. Franks admitted his own errors to you, though he doesn't even realize it. You might recall that I was asking him about the defendant in the example of someone with level 1. I asked him about a person who's able to speak in full sentences, engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation often fails, and his attempts to make friends are odd and typically unsuccessful. He agreed all those things were examples that matched the defendant. That's level 1, not level 2. You remember that. So you look at the history. He's got a history of mild autism, downgraded to Asperger's syndrome, and then elevated, put back in the autism spectrum. When Asperger's goes away, it just becomes part of the spectrum. His present evaluation was either autism level 1 or level 2, but even Dr. Franks told us that was mild. So you got to look at the time of the offense. And what did he tell you? Just like Dr. Franks, right? You got to look at all the facts. The defendant's self-report of what he was thinking. He's told us a lot about what he was thinking. And other objective sources of information. Communication leading up to the offense. Web searches. His communications at the time with her. They want to distance themselves from those text messages. But you just can't do it. And again, all the way back to 14, he was talking about the planning. It was him who was searching for the tape. And yeah, maybe they were mixing their odd relationship with the murder. And maybe the bondage tape would be used 2 ways, but we know he wanted to use it in the murder because he said so. Again, he wanted a machete. She couldn't get a machete, so she got him the best knife she could. He wanted a taser. And you also remember that he'd also read an article about someone had been tased to death. So, the text, they want to say they don't show any deliberation. He's finalizing the plan in his head thinking about it in the day, this is in the morning, in the day and hours before he goes to kill Dee Dee. Not only that, he was looking forward to it and excited about it. And he wanted to make sure that Gypsy, his submissive sex partner, was like she should be when she, remember he asked her about how she was going to present herself to him after the deed was done. And he knew how he was going to present himself to Dee Dee. You select this for a particular purpose. He didn't just want to kill her. He wanted to terrify her. That takes thought and planning. Yeah, she had gloves in the house because of how Dee Dee mistreated her, right? They had medical gloves. She didn't like to go out special and get them. But again, as we talked about before, and you know, she suggested he didn't need them. He wasn't like so under her power that he put on gloves. It was him who said, no, I'm going to wear them anyway. When you read the instruction and you listen to Mr. Perry's argument, he's, again, putting Dee Dee and Gypsy on trial, but they're not on trial. And it's not a question of, like my dog, was it a good dog or a bad dog? It's not whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. The question is, did he deliberate? Did he coolly reflect? You have over a year's evidence of him doing just that. And again, it's cool reflection upon the matter for any length of time, no matter how brief.
Like to her room, her mom's room, and so forth. She didn't go in the bathroom. She locked it. And I waited at least a minute and thought about if I really wanted to do it.
Waited a minute and thought about whether I really wanted to do it. And then he did it. You know that he deliberated. You know that he coolly reflected. We ask you to find him guilty of murder in the first degree and armed criminal action. Thank you.
Mr. Perry is agreeable on that?
Yes, Judge,
Let me go on the record here. We're calling in the State of Missouri versus Nicholas Godejohn. The jury has announced that they have reached a verdict as to both counts. Mr. Perry.
Judge, in speaking with Mr. Godejohn about the issue of if it is first degree murder, and I know none of us know what the verdict is going to be, obviously, but if it is first degree murder, in view of the fact that it's an automatic life without parole sentence on count one, that he's going to waive jury sentencing with regard to count two, which would be the only one which they would have any discretion. If it is a second degree murder or involuntary manslaughter on count one, he will not be waiving that.
All right. Mr. Godejohn, would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear the answers to the questions about to be asked of you today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You can put your hand down. Now, previously, you have requested jury sentencing in this matter. I have no idea what the verdicts are at this point. You've heard what your attorney has said. Do you wish to waive jury sentencing on count two in the event that the jury finds you guilty of first degree murder on count one?
Yes, sir.
And if they find you of a lesser on count one, you are still asking for jury sentencing. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Have there been any threats made to you to get you to waive that right?
No, sir.
Have there been any promises?
No, sir.
Have you had enough time to talk about it with Mr. Perry?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Perry, do you believe that your client fully understands his right to jury sentencing and the effect of waiving it in the event that a first degree conviction is returned on count one?
I do, Judge.
Mr. Patterson, on behalf of the state, do you have any objection to that process?
I do not object to that process.
All right, we'll get the jury into then. Okay. Thank you. Please be seated. I'll address my remarks to the foreperson. Have you arrived at a unanimous verdict as to both counts in the case of the state of Missouri versus Nicholas Godejohn?
Yes, sir.
Would you pass down the file folders, please? Thank you. The court has reviewed the verdicts and finds them to be in order. It will now announce the verdicts. As to count one, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nicholas Godejohn, guilty of murder in the first degree, as submitted in instruction number 6. We assess and declare the punishment for murder in the first degree at imprisonment for life without the possibility of probation or parole. As to count 2, and that's signed by the foreperson. As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nicholas Godejohn, guilty of armed criminal action as submitted in instruction number 10, signed by the foreperson. Ladies and gentlemen, because only the foreperson signs the verdict forms, I must poll the jury. You'll be asked the following question: are these your verdicts? If they are, answer in the affirmative, yes. If they are not, simply say no. So, Ms. Case, are these your verdicts? Mr. Cleaton, are these your verdicts?
Yes.
Ms. McAfee, are these your verdicts?
Yes.
Mr. Walker, are these your verdicts?
Yes, sir.
No, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Mr. Woods, are these your verdicts?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Blondo,
Yes.
have I said your name correctly?
Yes, you did.
Are these your verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Stoker, are these your verdicts? Ms. Vaughn, are these your verdicts? Mr. Amicus? Amicus. Thank you. Ms. Ortiz? Betis? Are these your verdicts?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Coble, are these your verdicts?
Yes, Your Honor.
And finally, Mr. Martin, are these your verdicts?
Yes, sir.
The jury's verdict is unanimous as polled. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started this matter, I told you that we would be having jury sentencing as to the counts in the event of a guilty verdict. The defendant has waived jury sentencing while you were deliberating. As a result, there will not be a need for you to deliberate further today on this case. The admonitions that I gave you earlier about speaking to anyone about the case are lifted. You are free to speak to whomever you choose. If you elect not to, that's fine too. Simply say, I don't wish to speak about it. There are 2 caveats though. First, you should only discuss your thoughts and views on the trial. Leave it to your fellow jurors if they wish to discuss their views. And secondly, you should never discuss with anyone your deliberations in terms of how the voting went. But with that, I know I speak on everyone in this courtroom. I want to thank you for your service. It's been a long 6 days for each of you. Well, frankly, the jury system would not be able to function without individuals such as yourselves willing to serve as jurors in these very difficult cases. If you'd like, my bailiff will take you downstairs and you can check out with Anthony. If you want to visit with me after I have about 5 minutes, I have to speak to the attorneys about something. If you want to wait in the jury room, some of you or all of you, I'm happy to come back and try to answer any questions that you might have, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. All right? But again, I want to thank you. So please rise. And Gary, for those who want to go downstairs, Cassie, you can take them down.
Yeah.
And for those who want to wait, I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Please be seated. Since the jury has returned the verdicts of guilty, Mr. Perry, I'll set the time for filing of new trial motions to December 11th. That's including the extra extension of time. If the state wishes to file a response, they should do so by January 4th. I'll order a sentencing assessment to be prepared, and we'll set this for sentencing on January 18th, a Friday, if you're available, Mr. Perry.
Judge, I'm not.
All right. It will be sometime in February then.
That's fine.
That would be February 22nd. And we may need that much time anyway,
Did you say the 22nd?
if that works for
That
your
works.
schedule. Does that work for your schedule, Mr. Patterson?
Yes, sir.
February 22nd then at 11 a.m. Parties will withdraw their exhibits and retain them. Is there any further record, Mr. Perry?
No, Judge.
Mr. Patterson?
Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for your work in this case. I know both sides have worked very hard. We're in recess.
I can make one request.
Yes.
Of his father.
I'm-
I'll do that.
I'm not permitted to allow that anymore. I'm sorry, Mr. Perry. I have no abandon in the custody of the judge. We're in recess. Rochelle, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, Judge.
There you go, guys. So that is the trial through and through. There were some definite inaccuracies in the closing arguments by the state, especially when agreed he deserved a more fair trial, but I agree he doesn't deserve to be out, and she certainly shouldn't be. But there was definitely some inaccuracies in that closing arguments, like when he mentioned the bitch is dead. That is something that Gypsy wrote, and she admitted to writing that. So why he said it was Nick is a joke. But he definitely, through the process of his interviews and everything at the police station, you know, you could see he needed that. There should have been more in place. He was just signing the what do you call it, the Miranda warning, like, this is sign, do you understand? And you could tell that there was something not quite right, and he should have had more guidance, supervision, and appropriate adult. I mean, she should have had an attorney. I mean, if you were going on the fact that everyone was to believe that her mental age was less than we were led to believe that it was. But obviously, she then serves her time, he's still serving his time, and he's never getting out, whereas she's served her time and she's got out early and she's on parole. And from all accounts, from what I'm hearing in different places across social media, at times she's violating a parole, but the parole officer seems to be sleeping on the job, and she seems to be getting away with that. Only Gypsy Rose Blanchard could probably get away with that, as well as murder, but that's where we are with the case. So we will start to, look at life after lockup, and aspects of, where we are now and how she is being treated, and the inaccuracies in her story. Well, actually, we probably won't quite get to the life after lockup just yet, because we want to divulge into some of the things that she said in different interviews in the past, Dr. Phil being one of them, where, again, the inaccuracies are there. We've got the medical records, we've got Dee Dee's autopsy report. Her medical records are interesting, that is for sure. But there's just been so many inaccuracies as she tells her story. And what I don't understand is how mainstream media doesn't spot all of these inaccuracies. I literally don't understand it. TMZ doesn't spot the inaccuracies. Lifetime doesn't spot the inaccuracies. And anyone that's supporting Gypsy doesn't spot the inaccuracies and holes in her version of events that's occurred. That being said, that is it for today, and we will be back at same time tomorrow, and we will start on a new discussion, and I'll even do a new thumbnail. I will see you guys very, very soon. Night, everyone, or morning, or afternoon, or wherever you are, whatever the time it is. I'll see you soon. Bye, guys.